Welcome back, fellow football fanatics. This is College Football with Sam, coming to you live on Saturday night during the Heisman ceremony and well after the Army-Navy game. Overall, the most quiet college football Saturday we have had since, August 17th, the Saturday before college football kicked off on August 24th of 2024. It's hard to believe that we're only a few weeks away from 2025, and we're only a few days, less than a week away from the first round of the first ever 12-team college football playoff kicking off. So we're going to be talking about that. I'm going to be giving you predictions for Ohio State versus Tennessee, Penn State versus SMU, Clemson versus Texas, Notre Dame versus Indiana, and we will also talk about Wisconsin, Michigan State, Michigan, and the Nebraska Cornhuskers. My cat is trying to greet us below my feet. You can't see him, but he's under my desk. Hopefully, he won't try and interrupt, but that's what we will be talking about here. The 4 college football playoff games taking place in the first round and 4 Big Ten programs that I have some interest in for the 2025 preseason from what they're doing in the portal or the coaching hires that they've made. And we'll just talk about them for a few minutes as well. Before we get started, though, I want to remind you all to please like the video, give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, click the notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new content on here and when we go live. I'm going live more often than I ever have because I finally figured it out, and I'm reaping the benefits right now of it. So a lot of the videos that you see weekly will be snippets of these lives, with the exception of the deep dives for games where I want to go 30 to 45 minutes in depth. For those type of games, I'll just record those on my own. Don't know why it took me so long to say that, but anyway, I see that you guys have a lot of questions. I even saw that Isaiah Cox sent in a $2 super chat. I appreciate you very much. If you haven't known already, for most of my live shows, we're not going to be answering most comments unless it's very brief and intermittent, with the exception of one show per week. I will be doing a question and answer session, as I know a lot of you like to ask me questions, and I like to provide answers. So save any questions you have or any super chats that you do have, but thank you, Isaiah Cox, for the $2 super chat. I'll at least say thanks if you send it during my live shows. Save all of that for tomorrow. Tomorrow, we are going to have a question and answer session after I cover some more things I want to talk about that I just didn't have the time to fit into tonight's show, because otherwise it would be a 3-hour show. So save your questions, your comments, your super chats if you have any. Save that all for tomorrow, because we're going to have a question and answer session that will go for quite some time. Tomorrow's show is going to be starting sometime in between 11 a.m. Eastern Time and noon Eastern Time. That's where it will be starting, is somewhere in that range. But thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to Kev. Thank you to Armand Hammer. Thank you to Super Saiyan Magikarp. Thanks to JT Sports, a good friend of the channel. He has his own great channel. Make sure to check it out. Thank you all for doing a lot. For Isaiah Cox, thank you for the $2 super chat. And Armand Hammer and Kev for being moderators on the College Football with Sam community. But let's dive in right now. Hopefully we can get up to 100 concurrent viewers, as this is, after all, a college football Saturday still. I want to bring us to Austin, Texas, to talk about Clemson and Dabo Swinney making a road trip to a new college football power. Old meets new, as Dabo Swinney and the Clemson Tigers, who have been viewed as a traditional college football power ever since the 4-team playoff era kicked off, basically, or maybe a year removed from that since they started winning at a high level in 2015, they are traveling to the Texas Longhorns, who are viewed right now as a new power. They are a traditional power, in fact, more of a traditional power than Clemson is, but 10 years ago when college football feels a lot closer to 100 or 50 years ago than it does 10 with all the changes that are being made. Clemson, in the eyes of a recent college football fan, or really the eyes of probably any college football fan, is a more traditional power than Texas is. because Clemson, ever since, 2014, 2015, 2016, right up until a few years ago, was winning national championships. They were beating Alabama. They were competing at the highest level. And Texas has pretty much been pretty dead ever since their 2009 appearance in the national championship. But here we are, and it's really a tale of two different programs. Texas has been very innovative. They've been aggressive with NIL, with the portal, with their hirings, with their firings. They have been doing whatever it takes, of course, within the bounds of ethics, because it doesn't sound like Texas is subverting any rules or anything like that. But they're doing whatever it takes within certain boundaries to win. Clemson has been very conservative, I feel, on the NIL front, on the transfer portal front. They have not been recruiting at an elite level, and their hirings and firings have also been very conservative, I would say, outside of the Garrett Riley hiring entering 2023. So this is a fascinating matchup in my mind. Clemson is an underdog, a double-digit underdog on the road as they're traveling to Texas, who is an 11-point favorite. This is the 5 versus 12 seed game. And let's dive right in and talk about what I think some critical matchups here are. I think that Clemson's offense, and specifically their passing offense, as I don't know the status of Phil Maffa, who tragically got hurt during the ACC championship game, be praying for him and his health. I don't know how Clemson is going to do on the ground and in the trenches overall against Texas, who has one of the most physical defenses in the entire country. Just think about how insane that would have sounded in the preseason. Texas coming off of a year where their secondary was not even inside of the top 100, and they lost Murphy and Sweat to the draft, so you figure their D-line's going to take a step back. That hasn't been the case at all. This secondary has went from being one of the nation's worst to one of the nation's best, essentially overnight in college football terms, and the defensive line hasn't dropped off at all. Alfred Collins has picked up right where Devondre Sweat and Byron Murphy left off. And at linebacker, Texas is pretty athletic too, and very impressive, I would say. The Longhorns' defense, Baron Sorrell and Vernon Broughton, Alfred Collins and Bill Norton on that defensive line, and also Trey Moore. Anthony Hill Jr., David Benda at linebacker, Jahdae Barron, Michael Toffee, Andrew Makuba, Malik Muhammad, and Jalen Gilbo at DB. That is the Texas defense. You look at the Clemson offense, wide receiver for Clemson, Antonio Williams, TJ Moore, Troy Stellato. Look out for Bryant Wesco Jr. as well. On the offensive line, Tristan Lay, Colin Sadler, Ryan Lithicum, Walter Parks, and Blake Miller. Tight end is Jake Bringingstool. Quarterback, Cade Klubnik. Running back, Phil Maffa. I don't exactly know what his health status is, so Keith Adams Jr. and Jay Haynes may have to take up some load for him at running back. That is the Clemson offense and what we're looking at in this matchup versus the Texas defense. And it's fascinating because Clemson is so much better in offense than they were last year. They're top 20 in points per game, scoring 34.4. They're scoring 0.456 points per play, 34th, much better than last year. They're top 20 in offensive touchdowns per game, top 15 in offensive points per game, and they're able to generate some explosives as well. And they start off games fast. They score 10.7 first quarter points per game, which is second. However, this Texas defense is, I would say, unlike anything that they've seen all season long, the Clemson Tigers have. You look at this Texas defense, they are second in points per game allowed, allowing 12.5, and they're also second in points per play allowed from their opponents, averaging 0.191 opponent points per play. And in terms of yards per play, Texas is first, only allowing opponents to gain 3.8 yards per play. They're second in total defense as well. They're top 10 in rushing defense and number 1 in opponent yards per pass attempt and opponent yards per completion. How can Clemson move the ball, particularly through the air, and can they protect quarterback Cade Klubnik? It's an important question. Another critical matchup that I look at here is Clemson's defense. Specifically, I would say their rushing defense. against a Texas offensive line that's one of the best in the country, against their running back room, mainly running back Quintravion Wisner, and also a little bit of quarterback if Texas decides to mix in Arch Manning there, which they do, especially in red zone situations or when they feel like the offense needs some juice. They'll put him in, maybe have him run the ball. Sometimes they'll have him pass the ball. This Texas offense here, Texas has great wide receivers, Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden, DeAndre Moore Jr., Quinn Ewers at quarterback, Gunnar Helm at tight end. They have great weapons in the receiving game, but quarterback's been very inconsistent, so they have not been able to utilize them, their offensive weapons, to the degree they want to. Kelvin Banks Jr., Cameron Williams, DJ Campbell, Jake Majors, and Hayden Connor, though, make up one of the best offensive lines, if not the best offensive line in the country. And Quintravion Wisner's really stepped up at running back with the injuries that have gone on there, and Jaden Blue and Jarrett Gibson also provide some depth. This is a lethal Texas offense at times. On the season, they have been very inconsistent. Right now, they're only 24th in points per game, scoring 33.6. In points per play, they only average 0.459, which is 31st. They only score 4.2 offensive touchdowns per game, which is 17th. Texas they don't run the ball that well at all. They only average 4.5 yards per carry, 6.1 yards per play. They're outside the top 25 in both those categories, barely inside the top 25 in yards per pass attempt, but that's because more so of their receivers, I would say, than the quarterback play they've gotten out of Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning, especially in conference play, SEC play, and the SEC championship game. So that's another matchup that I'm looking at here. That Texas offense and its dysfunctionality, but also its insane talent against a Clemson defense of TJ Parker, DeMonte Capehart, Peyton Page, and Peter Woods up front, Barrett Carter, Wade Woodaz, Sammy Brown at linebacker, Avion Terrell, Kylan Griffin, RJ Mickens, Jaden Lucas, and Khalil Barnes at DB. Can Clemson make Texas one-dimensional to the point where they just have to throw it and rely on the inconsistent accuracy of their quarterback to make plays? That's exactly what Georgia did. Georgia stuffed Georgia, they did stuff Clemson on the ground in week 1. They also stuffed Texas on the ground. And what Georgia is so good at doing is forcing your QB to get behind their defense. And they can. Georgia's secondary has been inconsistent, but they force you to stand in there, handle the heat, handle the pressure, take it all on your shoulders, and execute properly. Quinn Ewers has not been able to do that. It's a huge part of the reason why Georgia is 2-0 against Texas this year. Cade Klubnik is a quarterback who has not been great at that. Most quarterbacks can't stand in, take the heat from a Georgia caliber front, and get behind that secondary. Most can't. Some can, but most cannot. The question is, can Clemson's defense reenact that same strategy? Can they execute at that level and make Texas uncomfortable moving the football? I think that when you take a closer look at these offenses, with the inconsistency that Ewers has shown, and it's been very wild, sometimes he looks elite, other times he looks like a G5 caliber QB, kind of very up and down. I like Cade Klubnik's consistency, and I think that he is the better quarterback right now out of the two. You look at running back for these teams, I would give that to Texas right now because of the injuries that Clemson has sustained there. I would give tight end to Clemson. I think that Jake Brenningstool has been one of the better tight ends in the country, but so is Gunnar Helm. So tight end is an area where there are some pretty good playmakers there for both of these teams. It's rather close as a room overall. I think that wide receiver obviously goes to Texas, and the offensive line, we don't even have to ask that question there. Texas on the offensive line is a completely different animal from what Clemson is on the offensive line. I will say that Clemson, I mean, when you look at it here, their QB sack percentage, 4.38%, is 32nd. They're able to run the ball for 4.9 yards per carry. They have a better sack percentage allowed and yards per carry enforced compared to Texas. But also that's because Texas has had to play Georgia twice, and I do think that Klubnik's mobility and his superior traits help him to get out of the pocket and to make plays compared to a quarterback like Quinn Ewers. Quinn Ewers, in truth, this season has been a liability for Texas. If they had, let's say, just trying to peel through all the QBs this year because not many of them have played an elite level, but let's say they got Dylan Gabriel from the transfer portal, Texas, I think, would be a different team right now. They would be much better off than where they are currently. So just to quickly recap, I think that Clemson is good at QB and tight end. I think they're also good in the offensive line. They have some players at wide receiver. If Maffa's healthy, running back can be a strength for them too. But Texas outclasses them at running back, wide receiver on the O-line. They're elite on the O-line, can be elite, but I'd say near elite or great right now at wide receiver. Texas can be great at tight end. They have moments at QB, but I like Clemson's consistency there a bit more than what Texas provides. On defense, I think it's pretty clear that Texas rules. Just watch the film, watch these games, and also look at the analytics here where Texas in passing defense is top 10 in multiple categories. They're top 10 in almost all scoring defense categories, and Clemson is outside the top 25 in most of those. We don't need to talk about this all that long. Texas is better up front, in the middle, and in the backfield on defense compared to Clemson. In fact, I'll go as far to say they're better at every single position compared to Clemson on the defensive side of the football. Some other important factors to keep in mind. The line of scrimmage, I think, obviously goes to Texas. Better D-line, better O-line. The special teams is a push. Both have been very awful this year. Inconsistent kicking, inconsistent punting. That's why Texas just got Utah's punter out of the portal. They need a new one and a better one. Texas has the superior roster via the blue chip ratio, just looking from a pure high school recruiting standpoint. And I think that plays out in actuality too. Texas's roster this year looks way better than Clemson's does, respectfully. And they also play in a tougher conference at the same time. So there's probably an even greater disparity between these rosters than what your naked eye would tell you in favor of the Texas Longhorns. Texas should win this football game by double digits almost unanimously across all power ratings. Texas is favored by 14.3 points per football power index, just taking the difference in the rankings and then adding 3 for home field advantage. For S&P Plus, that number is 13.7 in favor of the Longhorns. And for my potential power index, it's Texas minus 17.8. Now, granted, my potential power index treats home field advantage a little bit differently, also factors in time travel and, distance traveled and all those different things. Some of these rankings do as well, but I don't know if it's the same as mine. Texas is favored by 17.8 points according to my power ratings, 13.7 for S&P Plus, 14.3 for FPI, just to recap. They're a double-digit favorite, and in the advanced analytics, things that really tell you about the dominance of a team and how they've done against their schedule, Texas, they have a 0.267 points per play margin and a 0.26 expected points added margin. They're both top 10 in those categories. They move the football well, and they do a good job of scoring, but more importantly, this is especially the case with Texas because their offense has been inconsistent at times. They do a much better job of shutting down their opponent's offenses and just keeping them from getting inside the end zone. Clemson's a little bit different. I'd say Clemson's offense has been a little bit better than Texas at scoring points. Given the schedule they have, I think if they played the same schedule, it'd be pretty clear that Texas has a better offense, but not by that much. But Clemson's defense can be a liability sometimes, especially in stopping the run. They have a 0.26 points per play margin and a 0.134 expected points added margin. So they, on an average basis, beat the opponents that they have played and do dominate them and move the ball on them better than their opponents do, but not to the same degree that Texas does with their schedule and opponents. Texas has played the 20th toughest strength of schedule. Clemson is 35th in that category. Surprisingly, the Tigers are 8th in game control and 12th in efficiency per ESPN. But Texas is 1 and 2 in those categories. And you add in home field advantage there, I think you can clearly see who the better team is. And on top of that, I think right now, Steve Sarkisian's a better head coach than Dabo Swinney. I think that Texas has a superior offensive staff, defensive staff, and I think they train their players better. I think their strength and conditioning is better. Their roster is deeper, not just because they recruit better, I think more importantly because right now they develop better. And with all that being said, that leads me to pick Texas to win this game and win, I think, in a pretty big fashion. Texas is an 11-point favorite. My model says Texas minus 17.8 is going to be the expected margin of victory for this game in favor of the Longhorns. I think that Texas covers, and I think they win, and I think it's going to be very similar to that Texas A&M game where Clemson scores 7 points, probably not off of a pick six, though I imagine they'll collect some turnovers because that's what Texas offense is they give you the football, which really kills their ability to win against high-level opponents. But Clemson is not a high-level opponent to Texas. They're not Georgia. They're not Oregon. They're not Ohio State. They're not Penn State. Clemson is not even Ole Miss, Alabama, or South Carolina. They're Clemson. They're a great team. They're not elite. They're not even near elite. This is a team that in most years would not... They fumbled into the 12-team college football playoff. And I think that this Saturday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Central Time, that's when this game kicks off, you are going to see that a team like Clemson should not be in the college football playoff. Texas is going to kill this team. 27-7, book it, and I don't know exactly what the whole Texas, like Nebraska's go big red, Michigan is go blue, Alabama's roll tide. I think, is it hook 'em horns? Hook 'em horns, and also go Tigers for you Clemson fans, but I don't know if you're going to want to hear go Tigers after this game. So Texas covers, and they win 27-7. Right, taking a sip of water here. That feels good. Let's see what y'all are saying in the chat right now. Not that much. Yeah, not that much being said. Oh, Travis Hunter just won the Heisman. Congratulations to him. Congratulations to Travis Hunter. You know, the more research I've done, the more I'm okay with him winning it. I thought it was clear that it was him and Jeanty and shouldn't be anyone else. I think that Jeanty should have won it, but the more research I did, I was kind of pretty okay with Travis Hunter winning the Heisman because just what he's doing in terms of being one of the nation's better wide receivers and also a good corner. I mean, that's pretty impressive. It's pretty impressive. I think Jeanty should have won it, but I don't have a big problem. I don't have a big problem with Travis Hunter winning it at all. Good for him. I think that he's a great guy. I think he's a freak athlete. I think he should do well in the NFL. Someone mentioned a criticism quickly. I'm talking about Sam's point of view that Penn State is the better roster than Georgia. I mean, would you rather have Drew Aller as your quarterback or Gunnar Stockton? Would you rather have the current Penn State running back room or Georgia's? Would you rather have Tyler Warren or whoever Georgia has at tight end between, Ben Urasek and Lawson Lucky and Oscar Delp? Would you rather have the wide receivers of Georgia or Penn State? Because Georgia's wide receivers are dropping the ball a lot. Which O-line would you rather have? Seriously, which one? I mean, Penn State's much better at running the ball, and defensively, Penn State's secondary has performed at a higher level. And while Georgia's defensive front, I think, has shown up in a bigger way in stopping the run, they don't have an Abdul Carter. I think Penn State is the better roster. I don't think that's an exaggeration at all, given all the injuries Georgia has sustained, while Penn State's been pretty healthy. Also factoring in that Georgia year over year sends guys to the NFL, and Penn State's returning more than Georgia is, especially entering this year. And you add in injuries to that, I don't think that's unfair at all. I don't think it's ridiculous. I think why Georgia wins at a higher level than Penn State this year is because they have that much better of a head coach. I mean, Texas was owning them for a half in the SEC championship game, but because of good coaching decisions, they held on and they won. It's as simple as that. It's the same reason why they beat Texas earlier in the year. It's why they were able to beat Tennessee after Ole Miss drummed them and they didn't get down on themselves, because they have the nation's best head coach. Coaching matters a lot. The team with the best roster does not always win it all. In fact, that's not even a guarantee that they win it all. Coaching, whether it's head coach, coordinators, assistant coaches, game planning, that has a lot to do with it. And while I think for the most part you'd probably rather have Penn State's roster as it stands right now in comparison to Georgia's, more importantly than any of that, you'd rather have Kirby Smart as your head coach than James Franklin. And I don't think that's a question whatsoever. There's no debate about that. Someone else saying Georgia's way more talent than Penn State. Yeah, talent, star talent, but what about the starting players right now? Like, Penn State is the better tight end. They have the better running backs. They have the better QB. Their O-line's playing at a similar level. They have a better defensive end. Their secondary hasn't gotten torched in the same way, even with the exception of them playing Oregon, and Oregon is the best passing offense in the country. Like, that's an opinion of mine. You can debate it. I don't think it's a debate talking about Kirby Smart as a better head coach than Franklin. That's not a debate. The only point I was making about that is, like, it's not this. This isn't like a few years ago when SEC met Big Ten and SEC wins because they had better coaching and the better roster. That's not how it works anymore. It's not, at least at the top. Like, I think that last year Michigan probably had the best roster in the country, and then there were a few teams, whether it was Ohio State or Georgia or maybe somewhat like Alabama. Alabama was the most talented team, recruiting rankings-wise, last year, and that team looked fickle in basically every game, except for the Georgia game and parts of the Michigan game. So, are we talking about best roster by talent, or are we talking about best roster by execution? Because I care about execution. Talent matters, but this late in the year, you are what you've shown the world to be, regardless of how many 5 stars you have. Like, I think that's pretty clear. But anyway, let's move on, and let's talk about something else. Let's talk about something a little bit different here. I want to discuss Wisconsin football. The Wisconsin Badgers finished the 2024 season on a relatively poor note, getting blown out by Nebraska, blown out by Minnesota, 2 teams that the Wisconsin Badgers have done well against historically and also in recent memory. And they got dominated by both of them. And they had a tough schedule this year, but Nebraska and Minnesota were winnable games. USC was a winnable game, even though that was on the road. There were many games where Fickell and his staff and his players had an opportunity to win, and they just couldn't do it. And Wisconsin's streak of over 2 decades of having a winning record at the end of their college football season and going to a bowl game is over. It's done. So Wisconsin needs to improve. I think they need to hit the reset button in some areas, and they have, to their credit. But how can their rebuild succeed? What do you think? What do you think Wisconsin needs to do to succeed in 2025? What moves can they make? Tell me in the comments section below. I think that staff changes were necessary this year. I asked the question, are staff changes necessary? Because that's not the case with every rebuilding team and program. Sometimes you just need better players. You need to recruit. You need to follow the process that you've set up. I think this is especially the case following year 1 of a rebuild, especially when it's a total rebuild and the cupboard is bare when you enter. But Wisconsin wasn't exactly that. And 2024 was year 2 of the rebuild, not year 1. And while I thought that for parts of this year, this team was better than the 2023 team, they regressed in terms of record. And at the end of the year, after they fired Phil Longo, it felt like the entire team had kind of hit the reset button and quit, when in reality, the season wasn't over. They fought against Oregon. They fought against Penn State, and they lost both of those games. They also fought against Alabama. They fought against USC. They fought against many teams. They even fought against Iowa. They just couldn't overcome them. And then against Nebraska and against Minnesota, it felt this way, especially against Minnesota. It felt like the team just imploded. So I think that staff changes were necessary, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I don't know if it was the wise move for Fickell to fire Longo before the season was over, but I think it was a good change in the whole. And hiring Jeff Grimes from Kansas, well, I don't think it was the absolute best move that he could have made. Grimes, a little bit of his backstory was he was the offensive coordinator at BYU from 2018 to 2020. So the Zach Wilson offense, that BYU team in 2020, that was just wrecking people on offense. That was his offense. He went to Baylor in 21, 22, and 23 to be their offensive coordinator and tight ends coach. Got fired in 2023 because Baylor had a losing record that year and their offense was a mess. He was the offensive coordinator and also assistant head coach for Kansas this past season. And Kansas offensively, I think, is what you dream of if you are Wisconsin. I mean, they did a phenomenal job at running the ball, and when their quarterback play was serviceable or better, Jalen Daniels had a rough start to the season, but he got better as the year went on. Well, they were able to score. Their points per game was 29.7, not amazing. Again, that and his prior stops at Baylor for Grimes are the reasons why I thought maybe a better hiring could have been made. 29.7 points per game, and Kansas on the ground ran for 211.4 yards per game, 5.5 yards per carry. They averaged nearly 3 rushing touchdowns per game. And the difference between Kansas and Wisconsin is Kansas doesn't have Mike Tressel as their defensive coordinator. They don't have the same players that Wisconsin does. They're less talented everywhere compared to Wisconsin from a recruiting standpoint. And from a developmental standpoint, I think they're not as talented in many areas on the defensive side of the football. Wisconsin has some elements of a good/great team, but they also have some elements of a team that is horrific and that does not belong in the Big Ten, but rather the MAC. Most of those elements do exist on the offensive side of the ball, so I think a change was necessary. And I think that Grimes, I don't know if he was an upgrade as a whole, as a offensive coordinator, as an individual over Phil Longo, but I think stylistically, he makes more sense. He runs a power spread. That's what he runs, compared to Longo, who ran an air raid where you can run the ball, but it's more quarterback-centric. Where I think what Grimes is doing on the offensive side of the ball, Kansas this year and his stops at Baylor, really were about running the ball and playing well on the offensive line, where he has been a celebrated offensive line coach, and he's done well at multiple stops when it comes to the lines of scrimmage. So that was an interesting move in my mind that I wanted to mention, that I saw and just thought was a little bit interesting. Now, how are Fickle and him and also Tressel on the defensive side of the ball, how are they going to recruit in the portal? Because they need to make moves in the portal. Sometimes when it comes to a rebuild, or when it comes to responding to a down year, a disappointing year, you need to make staff changes, but you don't necessarily need to make all that many roster changes. I think that Ohio State entering 2023 or entering 2024, more likely, was probably one of those situations. You don't need to make too many moves in the portal, but you need to make staff changes. Or for Ohio State, because in the past needed to make more staff changes, they need to make more staff changes this season and be very aggressive in the portal after whatever happens in the playoffs, because they're losing a plethora of starters. For Wisconsin, they need to make staff changes, which they have. Don't know if they needed to make more or less, but I feel like they at least made some. That's progress. You need to make roster moves. Quarterback play wasn't good enough. Tyler Van Dyke and Braden Locke are gone. They're in the portal. You need wide receivers desperately. You need a better wide receiver room. And running backs. You need a better running back room. Jez Malusi started the year at running back, and, well, he left the team because his injuries couldn't heal up, and that was a very unfortunate tale of events. But better depth at running back would be very helpful. Better tight end would be helpful. I saw that Wisconsin today actually got a tight end from the transfer portal, which is very helpful indeed. And it was a high-level tight end as well that the Wisconsin Badgers got. Tight end from Ball State, who had about 800 receiving yards and several receiving touchdowns as well. High-level MAC player, Tanner Kozol, I think is his name, how you say it. If not, my apologies. But good addition, I think. I think they need a tight end. Maybe could get another tight end. I don't know, but that's a great start. And the defensive line for Wisconsin has been a major issue, both in 2023 and 2024. They need better depth there, and they need a player who can maybe be an alpha or a dog in that room, because linebacker and DB I like for Wisconsin, but D-line, that's been an area of concern, I think, for the Badgers under Luke Fickell. So those are the changes that I think need to be made, mostly roster-wise. I think that Wisconsin's already done what it's going to do in terms of staff. Maybe they'll make some more changes as the month of December goes on, but they made the biggest change that was necessary, getting Longo out, bringing in Grimes, and still trying to be more forward-thinking than Paul Chryst was on offense, but also trying to understand that having an identity and especially being great at running the football is very important in the Big Ten Conference. So up next, we're going to talk about Penn State and SMU. I'm going to get a little drink of water here. Also check out what you guys are saying in the chat very quick. I like to do that as kind of a intermission. People are talking. Well, that's good. Keep talking away, guys. Keep talking away. Keep talking away. Okay. Well, we're going to talk about now SMU at Penn State. The ACC runner-ups, the SMU Mustangs, standing at 11-2, are traveling to the Big Ten runner-ups, the Penn State Nittany Lions, who also stand at 11-2. The difference is Penn State's at home, and they're an 8.5-point favorite currently. And what's interesting about this matchup here between the Nittany Lions and the Mustangs is the fact that these are two teams that have a lot of potential, in my mind, at a variety of positions. And yet, they've been a few games from completely putting it together. Penn State losing to Ohio State at home by 7. Could have been worse, but also could have been a closer game or a game in which Penn State pulls out a victory. They had opportunities to win. It wasn't a runaway Ohio State victory. Penn State versus Oregon, similar story. The only reason at one point it looked like Oregon might run away with it was because of Penn State's self-inflicted wounds. It could have been worse for Penn State, but it also could have been better. They lost to Oregon by 8 in the Big Ten championship game. Penn State, there's a universe where maybe they're 9-3 and in a bowl game instead of in the playoffs, but there's also a universe where they're 13-0 and the number 1 seed. For SMU, they're 11-2. They lost to 3 by BYU, and they lost to Clemson by 3 in the ACC championship game. And I think there is a universe where, yes, like that Duke game in overtime, SMU could be 9-3 going to a bowl game. There's also a world where they're 13-0 and they take the number 3 seed and they get that bye and they have a more secure position in the playoff. So that's what's interesting here. There's a lot of potential for these teams. I think especially for Penn State, as we will talk about in this video. Both of these teams also play Boise State in the following round. Now, Boise State's no cakewalk, but both of these teams, again, as we'll discuss, have great rushing defenses and they have a lot of talent. So the thought process, I think, should be take every team and every game seriously, especially if you're inside the locker room. There also has to be this awareness from an outsider perspective that the winner of this game should be heavily favored against Boise State. And perhaps you're looking at them like, how will they match up against Georgia or maybe Indiana or Notre Dame in the college football playoff semifinal in, I believe it's the Sugar Bowl. Correct me if I'm wrong. But let's talk about this and discuss what I think is a great matchup. It's taking place at noon Eastern time. That is 11 a.m. Central time for folks out in Texas, SMU fans. I think that what's important for both of these teams is for SMU making sure that you can move the football and making sure that you can replicate your success on offense. And for Penn State, you want to make sure that you're able to get pressure on Kevin Jennings, you're able to abuse that offensive line. And because your offense starts out slow, and same with your defense, typically, if your defense can start fast, if just one side of the ball can start fast in this game and then both sides of the ball can come together as the game progresses, you're hoping that you can gain a leg up here on SMU and just really execute a snowball effect in your favor. And that's why I think for SMU, you have to find a way to get behind this Penn State secondary that is good, but that has had some moments of vulnerability here. Let's talk about these two units, the SMU offense and also the Penn State defense. Penn State's defense is highlighted by Denai Dennis-Sutton, Zane Durant, Devon J. Thomas, Abdul Carter on the D-line, Tony Roas, Kobe King at linebacker, Jalen Kimber, Jalen Reed, Zakee Wheatley, AJ Harrison, Cam Miller at DB. For SMU on offense, wide receiver Moochie Dixon, Jordan Hudson, Jake Bailey, the offensive line of Savion Byrd, Logan Parr, Ja'Kai Clark, Justin Osborne, and P.J. Williams. At tight end, you got Matthew Hibner substituting in for the injured, done for the year R.J. Maryland, and we'll pray for his recovery. Quarterback's Kevin Jennings. Running back is, at this point, probably SMU legend Brashard Smith, because he's taken them a long way this season, 1,000-yard running back. He is a factor in this game, don't get me wrong. But SMU has struggled to run the ball overall this season, and their passing attack is really what helps them on the offensive side of the football. When you look at, rushing attack versus passing attack, Kevin Jennings, his wide receivers, the offensive line that's supposed to protect him, and his tight end. How do they do against, let's say, Abdul Carter, his fellow defensive lineman, and the Penn State defensive backfield? That's an intriguing matchup here. You look at SMU and their offense, they're scoring 33.6 points per game, 24th. 0.503 points per play. It's 15th. They're averaging 4.2 offensive touchdowns, or 4.1 offensive touchdowns per game. A correction there, 36.8 points per game, and 0.524 points per play for SMU's offense there. Got the wrong numbers, but we fixed it. You look at their yards per play, they're averaging 6.1 on the ground, and specifically in passing the football, they're averaging 8.6 yards per pass attempt, 13th, 13.4 yards per completion. Their QB sacked percentage is a 3.84%. So they do a pretty good job of protecting their quarterback. They're only rushing for 4.2 yards per carry right now, by the way, SMU is. So they're better through the air than on the ground. How do they go up against a Penn State defense that this season is only allowing opponents to score 16.4 points per game, 0.26 points per play, only allowing opponents to average 4.5 yards per play? That's 8th. And then Penn State through the air, they're top 25 in opponent yards per pass attempt and opponent yards per completion. The Oregon game really brought those down. As I've mentioned before, though, Oregon has the best passing offense in the entire country, and I think the epitome of that is against Ohio State. They torched that secondary, and no one else has come close to having that level of success against Ohio State's secondary all season long. That's one of the critical matchups. Another one, I think, is SMU's defense, really their rushing defense, against Penn State's rushing offense. Let's check out those two units. For SMU on defense, you got Elijah Roberts, Anthony Booker Jr., Jared Harrison Hunte, and Jafari Harvey on the D-line. You have Ahmed Walker and Kobe Wilson at linebacker, and Brandon Crossley, Isaiah Nwokobia, Ahmad Moses, Jalen Davis Robinson, and Cale Sanders Jr. That's their DB room. For Penn State on offense, Harrison Wallace III, Julian Fleming, and Liam Clifford, and also Amari Evans at wide receiver. Drew Shelton, Olivega Ione, Nick Dawkins, Sal Wormley, and Nolan Rucci. Tyler Warren at tight end, famous, top 10 in Heisman votes. And also, I think, the best tight end, one of the best players in all of college football. You have quarterback Drew Aller, but you also have to pay attention to quarterback Bo Pribula, Wildcat QB, and running backs Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. Penn State this season is averaging on the ground 5.3 yards per carry and 202.2 rushing yards per game. They're also averaging 8.8 yards per pass attempt, which is 9th. And they're scoring 0.503 points per play. That's 15th. and they average 4.5 red zone scoring attempts per game. That's 10th. A large part of that success, though, on offense is because of their rushing attack and the fact that it is a non-negotiable, and their offensive line is pretty good as well. So might actually be even the best in the country after that performance against Oregon in the Big Ten Championship game, but that could also be a one-off. So I'm curious to see how Penn State's rushing attack does in this game against an SMU defense that has been wicked at times and lethal in stopping opposing ground games. SMU right now is only allowing opponents to average 2.8 yards per carry. That's third. And in the air, they're getting 3.1 sacks per game, and they have a 7.72 sack percentage, and they're allowing less than 100 rushing yards per game as well. So this is a great defense, specifically up front for SMU. They get pressure. They challenge you at the lines of scrimmage. If SMU can shut down Penn State's rushing attack, and Penn State has to rely on those receivers and Drew Aller, this is going to be a game that has a chance of actually going in SMU's favor here, especially with the running back they have and also the offensive weapons that they have. They can score on this Penn State defense, and if SMU can really limit the bread and butter of Andy Kotelnicki's offense, the ground game, SMU might be able to take control, not just win, but take the reins, take control of this football game here. When you look at these offenses, I like SMU at wide receiver, and I also like them better than Penn State at offensive tackle. Penn State at wide receiver has been shaky this year. I think they're great at offensive tackle, but not quite at SMU's level. SMU quietly has one of the better offensive lines in the country. Not the best, but one of the better ones. They're also a push at center. I think both of these centers for these teams are rather impressive. For Penn State, that's Nick Dawkins, and for SMU, Ja'Kai Clark. Guard, I think, goes to Penn State. Tight end, running back, and quarterback also go to the Nittany Lions. Penn State, I think, has the better offense than SMU does, but it's closer than the, X Factor players and just the flashiness and Andy Kotelnicki being a factor might suggest. Watch SMU, also look at the analytics, and you'll see that SMU's offense is a really good offense, a really potent offense, actually. I like Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, and also Tyler Warren. Drew Aller does not have the mobility that Kevin Jennings does, and Kevin Jennings is a really good quarterback, but he has some turnover problems, and Aller has been more secure with the football, and his upside, you have to factor that in along with Kevin Jennings' upside, and Aller does have a high upside. You look at defense here, and SMU actually has some areas where they're pretty good. Linebacker and safety specifically, they grade out incredibly high. Corner is actually a weakness for SMU. Penn State doesn't really have any clear weaknesses like SMU does, but they're not the nation's number one defense. I think the Oregon game has shown that. I think games against USC have showed that. It's one of the nation's better defenses. It might still be a top 5 defense. I think that Ohio State's, for example, is the nation's best, and Oregon could have scored close to 40 points on them. Let's say they make that 4th down conversion that they missed in the third quarter. They score 39 points. That's it. And that was against what I think is the nation's number 1 defense there. So I think Penn State's defense is still really, really good, but it's not a perfect unit. I mean, you don't have a 2021 Georgia defense. You don't have a 2022 or 2023 Iowa defense, or a 23 Michigan defense, or a 2011 Alabama defense, for example. You don't have that with either of these teams. SMU, I like them at safety. I think linebacker is an area where there can be competition. Penn State's Kobe King is pretty good, one of the nation's best linebackers, but Kobe Wilson and Ahmad Walker are also good and up there nationally. On the defensive line, I strongly prefer Penn State, and I think also at corner, especially with A.J. Harris, Penn State quietly has one of the better perimeter defense units nationally. Other important factors, you look at the trenches, I think that leans in Penn State's direction. Better O-line, better D-line. SMU's better on special teams, though, and it's not particularly close. Penn State, for much of this year, has been inconsistent. Pretty mediocre to bad at punting. Return game's been And the kicking game, bad earlier in the year. It's been pretty consistent, especially from short to medium range, but Ryan Barker does not have this all-powerful leg, and he's not the most accurate guy in the world. He's like, let's say, on a scale of Big Ten kickers, where you have Dominic Zavada, and in comparison, you have Jaden Fielding. He's closer to Jaden Fielding than Dominic Zavada, though not quite as inaccurate, but still closer on that spectrum. And roster-wise, in both recruiting talent, but also in what the eye test tells me, and how many players you have that are developed at like to produce at a high NFL level, and also executing at a collegiate level too. I'd like Penn State roster-wise. They're more talented recruiting-wise, but they also execute at a higher level. They're tougher, they're bigger, they're better developed. You look at what the power ratings say. FPI projects Penn State to win by 6.6 points. S&P Plus thinks Penn State wins by 5.5 points. My potential power index is about as high on Penn State over SMU as it is Texas over Clemson. So make from that what you will. It is an outlier here, has Penn State winning by 17.6 points. It's an interesting spot, you know, with James Franklin. He's really struggled with winning big games. My power ratings do have they do have more factors than just roster. That's a hint for, you know, coaching being a factor. And James Franklin, you know, he definitely is not a top 10 head coach, and I think I've been pretty clear about that. Nonetheless, I do love Penn State's roster, the talent they have, and their assistant coaching. I also like what SMU has with their assistant coaches, and I do think their roster has an upside to it that perhaps has not been tapped into yet. This game should result in a Penn State victory per the power ratings. Mine is a bit higher on Penn State than others, and perhaps even lower on SMU, but I don't think so. It has SMU top 15, a borderline top 10, like most power ratings do. FPI is Penn State winning by 6.6, S&P Plus by 5.5, and my potential power ratings has Penn State winning by 17.6. You look at some other metrics here. SMU has a points per play margin of 0.23. They have an expected points added margin of 1.7. Penn State has a points per play margin of 0.244 and an EPA margin of 0.204. This is interesting as it shows that compared to points scored per play versus expected points scored per play, SMU's outperforming Penn State. SMU is more efficient given their field position, and I would actually say even given their talent in some respects, than the Nittany Lions are. Penn State's offense does a very good job. In fact, I would say they're the best in the country when it comes to moving in between the 20s. What's their problem, though? When they get into the red zone, they sometimes have to settle for more field goals than they would like. And they also oftentimes start out slow in the first quarter. SMU is a little bit more consistent on the offensive side than Penn State is. A little bit more balanced when it comes to execution by quarter. You look with Penn State right here, with their scoring offense per quarter, they are 66th in first quarter points per game, but then they're third in second quarter points per game, 33rd in third quarter points per game, and 41st in fourth quarter points per game. SMU is 9th and 14th in first and second quarter points per game, respectively, 64th in third quarter points per game, and 8th in fourth quarter points per game. A lot higher and more consistent across the board. Penn State, though, they're higher in points per play margin because, well, they do a better job than SMU does at stopping opposing offenses from scoring points and keeping them from getting inside the 20 and forcing some punts, forcing some turnovers. SMU's defense is outside of the top 100 in plays allowed per game. Their defense is used to being on the field for quite some time, and that can be a good thing, but also more likely than not that's suggesting that they struggle at getting stops, and that's not a good matchup when you look at Penn State and the offensive coordinator and the personnel that they have. Penn State's played the 30th best strength of schedule. SMU's played the 57th best. SMU's actually higher than Penn State in game control, 12th versus Penn State's 20th, and I think that has a lot to do with coaching. Penn State, when you look at it, has made some puzzling decisions in big games, many of them, and against some smaller opponents who they definitely outclass in talent and advanced metrics, they sometimes are slow or seemingly almost played down to their competition. Meanwhile, you look at efficiency, which is more, I think, more points per player, expected points added based across the board, while game control is comparing schedules and predicting how different teams would do against different schedules. Penn State's 10th, and SMU is 13th. Coaching-wise, I like Rhett Lashley better as a head coach than James Franklin, but I think that Penn State has the better offensive staff, the better defensive staff, and that they do a better job of developing their players currently than SMU does. So they have the better strength and conditioning staff. James Franklin, 1-14 against top 5 teams, 1-14. Huge losing record against top 10 teams as well, and not known to be a good game manager. I think he's done a great job of hiring assistant coaches and recruiting, but not at game managing, and that shows up in the biggest games. SMU's Rhett Lashley, shorter career head coaching-wise, celebrated offensive coordinator at multiple different stops. He's done a very good job at SMU so far, and I'm curious to see how much does this game come down to individual decisions, or maybe if it doesn't, maybe one team, whether SMU or Penn State, snowballs the other. At the end of the day, I think SMU is going to put up a fight here, but my model has Penn State favored by 17.6 points, and while I think it's not going to be a blowout, I do think that at the end of the day, Penn State is eventually going to pull through and win by a comfortable scoring margin. I think it will be close for a half, maybe for 3/4, but eventually Penn State, with the second half adjustments that they make, with their superior talent, and more importantly than their superior talent, they do have some matchup edges. For example, SMU can potentially take away Penn State's rushing attack, although I don't anticipate that will happen. But if they do, Penn State has Tyler Warren and Harrison Wallace III, and I don't think that SMU's secondary and defense is good enough to lock down both of them like Ohio State did for much of the game. And if SMU is able to score in a certain way on Penn State's defense early, I don't think they have the talent or the coordination or the leadership, like all these different factors that Oregon is elite at. I don't think they have that. And eventually Penn State's defense will adjust and they'll take away what SMU is doing offensively. So I think Penn State covers, and I think they win by a score of 34-17. Again, Penn State being favored by 8.5 points here. I think they win. I think they cover 34-17, and they will play Boise State in the Fiesta Bowl. That is who they will play. So there we have it. That's it. That's it for this game, at least. There are more games to go around. Oh, man. I don't know why I'm, like, warm, but... yeah. There we go. A little bit warm here, but the show ultimately marches on. Now we're going to talk about some other things, non-playoff related, like in regards to different teams. And then we'll get back to the playoffs. We've been bouncing around a little bit here, but I think that's more fun. You know, I've really been leading off the show so far with games that I don't think are going to be as competitive. For example, like I have Texas and Penn State both winning by 3 scores or more. And we're getting into the more interesting stuff as the show goes on. So stick around, invite others to join if they haven't already. And also, here is my reminder for you to like the video. Second reminder, like the video, share it around, subscribe to the channel. Also, please hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when I go live. I'll be going live tomorrow. I'll also be posting up a schedule for the rest of the college football season. I'll be treating this much like it is the regular season right up until the national championship game, and then after that it will switch to preseason mode. And then, you know, a week or 2 or maybe 3 before the 2025 season begins, it will be right back up to regular season mode, just to give you a little bit of an outline there. But nothing is set in stone yet, but there should be some concrete foundation laid this week sometime. Okay, so we talked about Wisconsin, and how can their rebuild succeed? Now I want to introduce you to Michigan State because they ended the season off also on a very sour note. The Michigan State Spartans concluded a 2024 season that I think started off with a lot of excitement, a lot of shooting from the hip and that succeeding, and some highlights, some lowlights, but overall a much better year than last year. And it all ended on a sour note because they finished 5-7, 3-6, and they suffered a blowout loss to Rutgers at home, which is something that I don't think anyone saw coming, but it happened. Michigan State is clearly in rebuild mode. They clearly need to improve and make changes in reaction to what was a 2024 season where they basically met their expectations. They didn't exceed them, nor did they exactly underperform the national expectations, where Vegas had their win total pegged at 4.5. Well, they went over by about a half win because you can't win 4.5 games in anything but paper and probability. They went 5-7. But a bowl game would have been very nice, and they didn't reach a bowl game. And with a lot of players leaving via the portal or graduating, and Michigan State having a tougher schedule than a lot of other Big Ten teams next year, but at the same time an easier one, I think, from a way too early perspective than what they had this year, what do you think they need to do to improve? To start off on the right path in 2025, and not just the right path in the short term, in the near future, but also the right path in the long term, in the long future, so that Jonathan Smith can build something, build a competitor, a contender at the Big Ten, perhaps the national level at Michigan State. Let me know in the comments section below. So I look at the Michigan State Spartans this season, and I think that while there were disappointing moments from the staff, overall, it was year one of a long rebuild with a lot of just frankly bad players. Mel Tucker left the cupboard barer and more damaged than Mark D'Antonio did. And Mark D'Antonio didn't do Michigan State any favors. Now, again, this is year one of a rebuild. Year one. We would be talking differently on this channel. I would be talking differently if it was year two and this was the result. It's very important that next year Michigan State goes to a bowl game and their team looks better. Fewer mistakes, some dominant wins against a program that isn't a part of the football championship subdivision. You need one against the football bowl subdivision, preferably a Power 4 school, preferably one in the Big Ten, maybe a few even in conference play. But ultimately, this was year one. And this was a roster that things had to just go right. And more things had to go right than wrong. Michigan State would have had to outperform the law of averages to do well this year. And I thought they were going to, because I think their staff is one of the better staffs in the Big Ten in America. By the way, I actually still believe that, even after this season, because it's year one. Aiden Childs was not nearly as good as I thought he was, as many, in fact, thought he was. And, you know, to a certain degree, it's a lesson to be learned. He played in a very limited capacity in a great system, an elite system, I think, offensively at Oregon State. Michigan State was never going to be at that level in year one. So I think maybe there were too high of expectations placed on Childs in the offense, but at the same time, it was not a good season at all, and Childs was a turnover machine, especially early on, but he never really got rid of that habit. I think that Michigan State's season this year is more of a reflection on the fact that their roster is lacking. Their staff is not lacking, in my opinion. They need better players. Mel Tucker did a horrific job of recruiting overall. Smaller classes with some talented players, but smaller classes didn't get the bodies exactly, did not read the portal well outside of Kenneth Walker, and if you watch the interviews from that past staff about Kenneth Walker, they did not expect him to be that good. So I don't think they were good at scouting, and they kind of fell into luck there with Kenneth Walker. Maybe more so Kenneth Walker fell into them, and they were lucky from that. You know, luck is a part of the sport, especially, I would say, in terms of certain things. Like, you're not always going to be elite at scouting or elite at recruiting, for example. And sometimes the ball will bounce your way or the wind will affect you. Luck, however, is not an excuse. It should never be used as an excuse because typically 99% of the time, if not 100% of the time in college football, you can overcome luck or there was a pathway for you to win in spite of things not bouncing your way. And for Michigan State under Mel Tucker, that was the fact that their staff was horrible at making adjustments, at adapting, and developing. Their strength and conditioning was bad. Their training was bad. The culture was bad. Michigan State is in a severe rebuild. This was year one. You added a win compared to last year. In every game of this season compared to the 2023 season, you looked better. Outside of maybe the FAU game. But in every other game, you looked better. Michigan State is a better team right now than they were in 2023. And I would say they're a more consistent team and less underperforming than they were in 2022. I think that's fair to say. What's also fair to say is they need to make severe roster changes. They need to go into the portal and make moves. Whether you bring in a new quarterback, one that ultimately maybe Aiden Childs is fine with because I do think he's very talented and I think he has a bright future, but just some competition for him. You bring in a running back to replace Nate Carter because Nate Carter declared for the draft, and I think K'Ron Lynch-Adams as well has run out of eligibility, very good running back for the Spartans. You get better at wide receiver. Nick Marsh is coming back, but many of the other wide receivers, including Jaron Glover, Isaiah Johnson, they're transferring out. On defense, moves need to be made as well because this defense was so much better than last year's, but you could tell that the players that they had were just not there yet, especially on the D-line, where no matter what blitzes were brought by Michigan State, no matter what adjustments they made, there was a streak where they didn't have a sack in like 5 or 6 games, and then it broke against Purdue, but that's Purdue. Purdue is horrible. They're the worst Power 4 team by almost every power rating system. So congratulations, but it's Purdue at the same time. They don't have the players. They don't. And what that means is you have to develop at a high level, and I think this season was to a certain degree an example of that because they were better at most, if not every position compared to last year. Better team overall. You need to scheme better. I think this year's an example of that. But you also need to recruit better. And I don't think this season was an example of that. You need to make better roster decisions. And on the front of NIL, I think there needs to be aggression there. I think there was under Mel Tucker, and I think it got pulled back a little bit after that whole disaster. That same aggression needs to be applied. So that way Derek Harmon doesn't go to Oregon or Simeon Barrow Jr. doesn't go to Miami. Both of them at their respective schools were awesome this year. If they were at Michigan State this season, just those two players alone, maybe Michigan State goes bowling. Maybe they win another game, or maybe 2, but more likely probably 1. Who knows? Players like that, both of them X-Factor players. I don't know about unicorns or aliens, but X-Factor players, some of the best players in the country at their positions, especially at Michigan State where you don't have loaded 5 stars or 4 stars or stacked classes or a regime that's been there for 10 years under your belt, on your tool belt. You need to retain them. And thankfully for Michigan State, it looks like they're going to retain Nick Marsh and maybe some other players as well, like Aiden Childs, although I don't know what elite program right now would want Aiden Childs. There's more risk there than we thought entering the 2024 season. All that to say, though, roster changes are an absolute necessity. And if those changes are made, especially along the offensive line, Michigan State, I would say, you need 4 offensive linemen, if not 5, maybe more in the portal, and spend on them. Michigan State makes those moves. They invest with NIL. They recruit hard in the portal. And they also continue to, I think, be an elite staff because I think this staff is elite. The results will bear out. Maybe I'm wrong about the staff, but I want to see more than just a year of sample size with very limited talent and very limited players before I draw any conclusions. So that's Michigan State right there. Let me know what you guys think in the live chat. Let me see what you all are saying in the live chat here. Someone was saying, keep chopping, we'll see. What were people? Oh, yeah, Joe Rossi. People were talking about Joe Rossi. their defensive coordinator. Thieneman is going to be a monster at Oregon. I absolutely agree. I think that was a huge get for Dan Lanning and company. Huge get for the Oregon Ducks. All we have to talk about now, final few games of the college football playoff. Then we also got Michigan and Nebraska to talk about. And just to say if, and I mean if Ryan Day loses to the Volunteers in Columbus, Day might die of a heart attack before next year. He does look very stressed. Ryan Day does. I mean, every interview I see him with, his bags are like popping. His bags are popping out of his eyes in the same way that like a ripped, jacked man with like 5% body fat, his abs are popping out of his stomach. His bags are huge. They're huge, and it's probably something that can be cut for more nefarious purposes, that clip. But I'm serious. He looks tired, like he can't sleep, like he's stressed out. And I kind of feel a little bit bad for him. At the same time, he knows what this job entails, and I think also that Day is putting too much stress on himself. I think if Day took himself and the job more lightly, I think he'd be better off. I think Day's an emotional guy. He's not a sociopath. And if you're an emotional guy, sometimes you got to take a chill pill and you'll actually work harder and you'll be better. I don't think that's the case with like Urban Meyer, for example, or Jim Harbaugh or Nick Saban, like these guys that thrive off of intensity or conflict. I don't think that's Day. I don't think Day thrives off of that. I don't. And that's nothing against him. Nothing against him at all. I just think he needs to rework some things and make changes. And they can win it all. Ohio State can this year. They can absolutely win the national championship. They can. Urban almost coached himself to death at OSU. Yeah, Urban Meyer certainly had his health problems. Certainly did. And he basically pushed through until he couldn't. That was Urban Meyer. And by the way, for any of you speculating, he's never coaching again. Not happening. Just pay attention to those who are close to him, who keep in contact, who've worked with him. They're all saying unanimously he's not working again as a head coach. And that makes sense. He shouldn't want to. He's been away from the game for long enough. I don't think he would work well in the NIL transfer portal era. The players right now are not as hard, not as thick-skinned as they used to be, in part because they don't have to. They can transfer away. They're not stuck where they are. So a lot of that's on like other things besides them. And he's, more importantly than that, he's been away from the game for like years. It would take a lot to re-enter that environment. But let's move on. Let's move on, shall we? The Michigan Wolverines ended the 2024 season on a high note. They went 7-5. They lost 5 games. They got humiliated at home by Texas and Oregon. They were not national championship caliber, and they were not even close to that caliber. In fact, they were not even close to Big Ten championship caliber. But you know what? They beat Northwestern to go bowling, which at least made it so that they were not like TCU, who made the national championship game and then missed a bowl game the following year. And they did it in dominant fashion, got some of the younger players playing time, and they also beat Ohio State. More importantly than that, they beat the Ohio State Buckeyes in Columbus by a score of 13-10. Huge victory, not just for the players this season, but also for the program, adding encouragement to the future, the fact that Sharon Moore could win a game on the road, that he could beat Ohio State, a top 2 team at the time, still unanimously top 5, top 4 in terms of power ratings. He could beat them, that he could out-scheme them, that he could bait them into doing what he wanted. And Michigan did. And Michigan won that game, and that was huge for the program. And also, Sharon Moore got the boosters involved. He rallied them. And now Michigan is spending. They spent to get Bryce Underwood to Michigan, and they also spent to get some other players committed. And it sounds like they're going to spend in the portal, though Michigan has only gotten 1 recruit in the portal. Wide receiver from Indiana, Donovan McCulley. Their crystal ball to get quarterback Billy Edwards Jr., who entered the portal from Maryland. But that's for now. They also hired offensive coordinator Chip Lindsay. And it feels like, from what we have heard, doesn't mean it's the truth though, that more changes are to come and that Michigan is really building to have a 2025 season that is much closer to their 2021, 2022, and 2023 seasons rather than their 2024 seasons. So what might the Wolverines look like in 2025 based off of all of this, and how good of a job, in my opinion, but also I want to know your opinion on this, how good of a job are they doing right now in building for 2025 and the future? Let me know down below what you think about Michigan's moves so far. We're going to start off with Michigan hiring Chip Lindsay to be their offensive coordinator and also, their quarterback's coach. I'm going to grade this hire as a B+. I think Michigan could have done better. Chip Lindsay was not someone who, in my thought process, though I'm not a coach, never will be, don't deserve that type of authority. But from my perspective, I thought that Michigan was going to hire someone else. He was not on my board. And when he popped up, I'm like, okay, much better than Kirk Campbell, better than I would say like Florida State hiring Gus Malzahn, which is where Chip Lindsay came from. He's a part of the Gus Malzahn tree. Better than, let's say, Alex Atkins, another Florida State, or Marcus Satterfield, or, Tim Lester, or, other hires Michigan could have made, but also not the highest level hiring. I don't do a lot of coaching hotboard lists because I don't cover one specific team, and I'm kind of all over the place, but I'm just mentioning that to say that I think Michigan could have done better, but I also think that overall this was a good hire because his run-heavy scheme, he's done well running the ball at North Carolina, at Auburn. I think that fits into Michigan's identity. And I think him being able to coach Bryce Underwood, who's a mobile QB, and Lindsay has experience with mobile QBs, whether it's at North Carolina or Auburn, I think fits well. I believe that with what Michigan is bringing in via their high school recruiting class and what they could be bringing in through their portal class and what they also could return, I think that Chip Lindsay is going to have a lot more success this coming year than what Kirk Campbell had this season. Much better quarterback play. Michigan will probably be better at receiver just from using the portal. And, I don't think Donovan McCulley's the first to commit, but maybe he is. It's very speculative with the portal because Michigan isn't the only school with a lot of money. There are other schools with a lot of money. And we'll talk about this more in this video, but they also need to make some roster moves at other positions, at a plethora, I think, of positions, if they want to have the success they're talking about desiring this coming season. Run-heavy scheme fits Michigan's identity here. And people talked about, him being a big part of the reason why Drake May regressed. I don't know enough about that to get into the specifics because I'm not an elite X's and O's guy, and we cover the Big Ten here. We try to cover college football nationally, but North Carolina has not been a school that's on my radar in the same way that Georgia is, or Alabama is, or Oregon, or Ohio State, or Michigan, or even like Texas, for example, or even Miami, because North Carolina's been a school that doesn't invest all that much in football. It's just been kind of there, like, oh, cool, you have Drake May and some offensive weapons, but your defense is memed. It's like an Alex Grinch defense. You can't stop anyone. So, they made an ACC championship game appearance with Phil Longo as their OC in 2022, and Drake May looked horrible in that game against Clemson. So, I'm not exactly going to comment on that. But what I can comment on is his consistency in running the ball and doing well at that. And the fact that his quarterbacks have been anywhere from, I would say, below average, depending on his stop, to more likely than not above average good. His coach Jarrett Stidham and also Drake May, two good quarterbacks and had a hand in them being good. So the grade here, B+, not, I think, the perfect hire, but a good hire nonetheless. And I've thought, again, because I'm not the head coach, I'm not the CEO, I'm not the smartest guy in the room here, not even close. I've thought poorly of some past Michigan hires or past hires at other schools, and they've turned out well. So we'll just have to wait and see. What I think needs to be done in the portal is you need to get a good quarterback, or at least a starting caliber quarterback with good potential. Billy Edwards Jr., he might fit that bill. I thought Miller Moss would have been better, but he's going off to Louisville. Looks like Michigan's going to get Billy Edwards. Kalel Mullings is gone. Donovan Edwards is gone. I think Michigan needs a high-caliber running back from the portal. Think Justice Haynes from Alabama, who entered the portal, could be a good addition. And there are some others as well who I think could fit that bill. At wide receiver, my dream would be getting Eric Singleton Jr. That it would. And then also Kobe Paysour, who entered the portal from North Carolina and obviously has some familiarity with Chip Lindsay, who was his offensive coordinator. Not saying Michigan gets those guys, but just some names to put out there. For the O-line and for the D-line, I don't have exact names right now, of course. The portal is not even close to closing. There are going to be more names, more high-caliber names that enter. But I think Michigan needs some guys who are just going to be good players, not non-negotiables, but just good players in the trenches to add depth. But also maybe an X-factor player or two there. Michigan is going to bring back Rashawn Benny, who is graded out as one of the best defensive tackles in the country, and I believe he is. But you're losing Mason Graham. I think Michigan's losing Kenneth Grant, though I'm uncertain. I know Mason Graham declared. And there will be other losses, too, in the trenches. So getting depth there and good players to still be elite in that area like they have been the previous 3 years, that's very critical. And at defensive back as well. Michigan needs better players at DB. They do. You're losing Will Johnson, didn't play for much of the year, but still big loss. And the DB room was one of the more disappointing rooms for Michigan this season. What would be nice to have is maybe a good tight end, although I think Michigan has, Marlon Klein, who's been impressive, backing up Colston Loveland. It would be nice, too, to get some more depth at linebacker or maybe a good player there. Ernest Hausman and Jayshon Barham will come back, but I don't think they were well coached this year. I think Brian Jean Mary, in fact, was a coach that Michigan should have moved on from after this year. And maybe they will. Maybe they will. I don't know. I don't know if they will or won't. I mean, I kind of figure, you make the change with Kirk Campbell after the regular season. You probably make some other changes as well. But maybe they're waiting until, after the bowl game because maybe they're looking at staffers who are on the playoff. I don't know. I really don't know because, again, I'm not an insider for any of these programs. It's just my perspective. My thought process on Michigan's moves are to be determined roster-wise because they're not even close to doing what they should do in the portal. And the portal's only been open for so long. The number one class in the portal right now, I think, is Texas Tech or Ole Miss, and they only have 6 to 5 commits at the most. Michigan is 1 in Donovan McCulley. And many of these classes will finish with 20-plus guys. Like Ole Miss and Texas Tech, I fully expect to finish with more than 10 players. But I know one thing for Michigan. More coaching changes are necessary. I think that Brian Jean Mary should be out. I think you got to look at, Grant Newsome. You got to look at Lamar Morgan. I think Lou Esposito did a good job with the D-line this year. Josiah Stewart took a big step from where he was last year. Rashawn Benny's taken steps forward. I've thought at times even that Michigan's D tackles this year were at times better than last year, although maybe Lou Esposito just had so many riches that he didn't have to do much on the D-line. Michigan special teams, Dominic Svada have been good, though Tommy Doman transferred out, so something I forgot to add, but Michigan needs a punter from the portal, bless me, unless they think they have a good one in-house. And I think that you also got to look at, offensive coordinator change was made, but the O-line was unimpressive even with the talent that it had, so I don't know where Michigan is there. And I think linebacker and DB, those were very disappointing rooms with all the talent they had. So maybe I'm wrong, but I think that more coaching changes are necessary for the Michigan Wolverines. And Michigan, a large part of the reason I'm saying that is they have high expectations next year. These are not just my expectations. In large part they are, but Michigan next year, with the schedule they have and with the moves they're making recruiting-wise and what it sounds like they're going to make in the portal, they want to contend for the Big Ten and the college football playoff next year, potentially the national championship. I think that 9-3 or anything below that's a failure for Michigan. Let me read you, in fact, next year's schedule to kind of prove my point to you. This schedule is one of the easiest, I think, in the Big Ten. It's definitely in the bottom half, if not the bottom third of the Big Ten when it comes to schedules. And this includes the non-conference. I know they have a game at Oklahoma, but Oklahoma losing a lot to the portal. I think they had a worse year this year than Michigan did as a whole. New Mexico is Michigan's first game August 30th, then at Oklahoma September 6th. Central Michigan September 13th, at Nebraska September 20th. Then there's a bye. Then they host Wisconsin October 4th, travel to USC October 11th, host Washington the 18th of October, play at Michigan State October 25th, host Purdue November 1st, then they have a bye, play at Northwestern in Wrigley Field November 15th, so sort of a neutral site game, at Maryland November 22nd, and they host Ohio State November 29th. This is an easy schedule. Michigan could go 11-1 or 12-0 with this schedule and not be a top 5 power rated team, in my opinion. You know, maybe you get a close win over OSU, some other close wins, maybe some dominant wins, and you're not a top 5 team via power ratings, but you're 12-0. Sort of like how Oregon has been for much of the year, although I think Oregon should be top 5 unanimously in power ratings right now. They were just unfairly weighed down by some of their games early in the year. But anyway, I think 10-2 or higher is where you're not talking about a failed year. I think 10-2 with this schedule is all right. You know, you might get to the college football playoff with the schedule. You probably do, as long as the losses aren't bad and the wins are, you know, good. But I think 11-1 or better is where you start talking about success, because then you probably get a home playoff game. You're talking about competing for potentially a Big Ten championship. Maybe these expectations are too high, but I don't think they are. It's a continuation of what has been the norm for Michigan, rather than accepting what was a very mediocre, not just mediocre, but bad season. I think 9-3 is a failure. Same with anything worse. 10-2 is all right. It's not a failure, but it's not something to be ecstatic about, especially if 10-2 includes a loss to Ohio State. 11-1 or better, that's a success, even if that one loss is to Ohio State, or if it's to Michigan State, or maybe it's to someone else. That and having an undefeated year are a success. As it comes to the college football playoff, you missed the 12-team playoff this year. Just get to the 12-team playoff in 2025 on top of winning 11 games. I think that's a successful season for Sharon Moore and the Michigan Wolverines. And up next, we'll talk about Indiana at Notre Dame. But before we do that, I am going to quickly take a break. See you, Sam. Thank you for coming on. We do have more to talk about. The show will probably go until like 10:30, maybe 10:45. Yeah, I'll be right back. Just gotta use the bathroom and fill my water back up. So I'll see you guys pretty soon, in probably like a minute or two. And welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. Just got back from refilling up the water, which is delicious, cold, refreshing as always. Let's see what everyone's saying in the chat. And by the way, if you're new here, like the video, subscribe, hit the bell. It's the easiest thing you can do. Doesn't take much time, and that way you get notified when I go live again, and you help us become the best college football channel on YouTube. By the way, I'm doing a giveaway before the end of the season. The announcement will be posted in the next few days, definitely by Wednesday. Want to do it a few days before the playoff begins. We'll be doing a giveaway to celebrate us reaching 20,000 subscribers. We're now at 21,000 subscribers. Thank you, Colonel Cadmium, for subscribing and liking the video. We'll be doing a giveaway to celebrate 20,000 subscribers. So stay tuned for that. You won't want to miss it. Okay, well, let's get down to business here and talk about Notre Dame at Indiana, which I'm actually... See, this, I think, is the best matchup. Going to give you a sneak preview that won't be included in the cut of this video. I think this is the most fascinating matchup and the most exciting one, and it's going to be the closest game. The most intriguing one is what we're going to be talking about last, which is Ohio State, Tennessee, because of the drama surrounding that. Not just for Ohio State, but if Tennessee loses, it's going to be another, oh, Tennessee was so close, but they failed, like, meme moment. And if Ohio State loses at home, it's going to add to the lore of how humiliatingly disappointing the 2024 team has been. Because I think we all agreed in the preseason, 10-2, depending on who the loss is to, was an absolute failure. Not reaching the semifinal game or winning the Big Ten is a failure. They haven't won the Big Ten. They didn't beat Michigan. Not beating Michigan was going to be a failure. And 10-3, this 10-3 in particular... Oh boy, this 10-3 would be worse than Ryan Day going 9-3, losing to Penn State, Indiana, and Oregon, but then beating Michigan and winning the bowl game. This 10-3, I think, would be worse than that. Which, I mean, maybe that's not true, but I also think that Michigan loss was humiliating, and I don't think Tennessee is as good as Penn State or Indiana, but they're better coached than Penn State, and they have more talent than IU, so I also think they match up better with Ohio State in ways than the Nittany Lions and Hoosiers do. But let's get down to business, and let's talk about Indiana at Penn State. The Indiana Hoosiers, college football's greatest story of not just the 2024 season, but I would say of the 2020s decade. Yes, one of the worst programs ever in college football, in terms of not just being Power 5, Power 4, but overall, is 11-1. They're playing at the level of a top 10, top 5 team, dare I say it, in terms of analytics and even the eye test. And they're traveling to the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, who are also 11-1. They have their best season yet under Marcus Freeman, and they are playing and executing at a top 10, top 5 level too, and analytically, they're even number 1 in some categories. According to ESPN's efficiency, Notre Dame is number 1. They're the most efficient team of the 2024 year. The only reason, I will say this here, the only reason I believe that Notre Dame is behind Texas and FPI is because Texas is a 5-star quarterback in Quinn Ewers, and Notre Dame doesn't. I think recruiting rankings are the only thing, specifically at the quarterback position, where ESPN's FPI states nakedly, we treat a 5-star QB like he's special. They care about recruiting a lot on FPI. If not for that, I think Notre Dame would be power rated number 1 in FPI right now. And it's despite the fact that they lost in one of the most humiliating ways I've seen a team lose to NIU this year. But outside of that game, they have won, and in many cases, they have dominated and game-controlled their opponents to death. The Fighting Irish are favored by 7.5 points. This game's taking place in South Bend. It is the Friday night game. 3 out of the 4 first-round games are being played a week from today, Saturday at the time of this live show, on the 21st of December at noon, 4 p.m., and 8 p.m. Eastern Time. This game is being played Friday, December 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. In-state matchup between two schools who recently have not gotten this far. Notre Dame at times has, but they've always failed at the biggest stage. They have not won a New Year's Six bowl game since the 90s. I would count this because it's a college football playoff game. It's a big game. They're playing a top 10 team in Indiana. Indiana has not appeared in anything like this ever since, the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. They have not been anywhere near the mountaintop of not just their conference, but the nation this century. And this is an opportunity for them, and also an opportunity for Notre Dame. So, as I have said, I think this is the best matchup of the college football playoff in the first round. I think this is the most fascinating, and sneak peek, I do think this is going to be a close game, a competitive game. Let's start off with some key matchups here for the Irish and the Hoosiers. It's Indiana's passing offense. I know it lists every position here, but I'm going off of this in passing offense with quarterback, wide receiver, and then tight end, and also running back, O-line, and tight end when appropriate as the pass blockers against Notre Dame's defensive front. How does that work out? What does the dance of the trenches look like, and who does it favor, especially in pass rush for Notre Dame and pass protection for Indiana? Because it can go technically there's more than two ways, but there's two sides to the spectrum. So we'll just say one of two ways. It can lean toward the side of Jim Knowles is sending more guys than you can block, and Curtis Rourke just falls down. You can't do anything through the passing game. It can be Indiana versus Ohio State redo in favor of Notre Dame. And at that point, Notre Dame probably wins unless Indiana's defense puts together a phenomenal effort, or Notre Dame's offense looks like poverty, like in the NIU game. Or it can go the way of how Indiana versus Michigan went in the first half, or how Indiana versus Nebraska went, where you go up against a great and awesome defensive line, good defensive front, and you either work them or you do just enough in protection to where your weapons can make something happen. That is a spectrum here that will determine the outcome of this game, for sure. Because Indiana's offense has been ridiculously efficient, impressive through the air. And then you look at just what they have done overall this year is impressive. But you look at their offense, they're scoring 40.3 points per game, which is second. And if you count the FCS game, they're scoring 43.3, I believe, at points per game. Their average scoring margin is plus 24.5. They're first in yards per point, averaging 10.3. Notre Dame's second, by the way, in that category, averaging 10.6 yards per single point. Indiana is second in points per play, averaging 0.598 points per play. Notre Dame is first, averaging 0.622. These teams analytically are some of the best teams in the country. Now, as I mentioned in my very early preview, they have not played very tough strength of schedules. I imagine if they played, let's say, Georgia's schedule, they would not be as analytically impressive. But still, these are some of the best teams in college football. They are. And Indiana, because that's what we're talking about offensively, has done a great job of not punting and of scoring touchdowns, of getting into the red zone. Right now, they are averaging 5.3 red zone scoring attempts per game, which is first, and 5.1 red zone scores per game, which is first. They have a red zone scoring percentage of 96.55%, which is first. And in terms of total offense, they're averaging 414.9 yards per game, which is 41st. They're averaging 6.2 yards per play, which is 26th. They're averaging 4.2 yards per carry on the ground, 9.2 yards per pass attempt, which is fourth, an average team pass rating of a 171.5, which is second. And in terms of protecting the quarterback, they allow a 5.56 quarterback sack percentage, which is 53rd. But a lot of those sacks came from OSU, and it's not like this offensive line is bad as we'll talk about. In fact, it's a highly graded offensive line. I just don't think they have any explosive running backs, and Curtis Rourke does not have extreme mobility, so that doesn't help him in terms of escaping opposing pass rushes. But this is interesting. This matchup is here because you look at Notre Dame's defensive front, and they're very impressive in defending the pass. I mean, Notre Dame's defense here, they only allow 13.6 opponent points per game, which is third. 0.2 points per play, which is third. They only give up 4.4 opponent yards per play, which is fifth. Indiana's third there, only giving up 4.1. They have a sack percentage of 8.09%, which is 25th. They only allow 5.6 opponent yards per pass attempt, which is second, but also 11.4 yards per completion, which is 44th. That's because they don't let opponents complete passes on them. They're first in opponent completion percentage, only allowing 48.68% of their opponents percent of their opponents' passes, to be completed. But then there's also some weakness there, some vulnerability. They allow opponents to average 3.7 yards per carry. I think some of that's due to playing service academies and a Georgia Tech, to be frank. So there's probably a negative bias there. But both of these units, Indiana's passing offense, Notre Dame's pass rush, and defensive front, they're great. They're near elite, and maybe relative to this year, they're elite. But they're not generational. There's no Jalen Carter on Notre Dame's defensive line. There's no, let's say, Amarius Mims or Olu Oluwatimi on Indiana's offensive line, though Mike Caddick at center has been very impressive. This is the matchup that fascinates me the most, ultimately. And then there's also Indiana's defense, but specifically their rushing defense, trying to stop a Notre Dame rushing offense that is prolific. If there's any part of a college football team that might be generational, it might be, or maybe not generational, but at least elite, not relative to this year, but just elite in general. It could be Notre Dame's rushing offense. They are averaging 6.3 yards per carry, that's second, and 224.8 rushing yards per game, which is 11th. And they only average 35.7 attempts per game. They don't run that many plays. Notre Dame only runs 64.1 plays per game, which is 116. But what I will say, the best teams don't run that many plays because they don't have to. They get up on you big, they make explosives, they're efficient, and they don't punt a whole lot. They have fewer possessions because they don't need more possessions to score and beat their opponents into submission. Mike Denbrock is running a show over there. He's one of the nation's best offensive coordinators, if not the nation's best offensive coordinator. The same coordinator that last year turned Jaden Daniels into a Heisman winner. The prior year took over an LSU roster that was a mess and made a lot from it. Helped Brian Kelly a lot at LSU. He's back at Notre Dame, and Notre Dame's averaging 6.6 yards per play overall, which is ninth. Their passing offense, pretty poor, but not bad, not terrible. And I think a lot of it is poor just due to the limited talent at wide receiver. The fact that Riley Leonard's always been more of a dynamic quarterback, not strictly a passing quarterback. Notre Dame's offense runs through Jeremiah Love, through Jadarian Price, through this offense where, let me tell you the different starters here. Notre Dame offensively, Bo Collins, Jordan Faison, Jaden Greathouse at wide receiver, Anthony Knapp, Sam Pendleton, Pat Coogan, Rago Spindler, and Emil Walker on the offensive line. Mitchell Evans at tight end, who's now thankfully healthy. Quarterback Riley Leonard, and running backs Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price. Against an Indiana defense, they're going to be tasked with stopping Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price. Michael Kamara, C.J. West, James Carpenter, Tyreek Tucker, Linnell Carr Jr. on the defensive line, Jalen Walker and Aiden Fisher at linebacker, and D'Angelo Pons, Sean Asbury II, Amari Farrell, Jameer Johnson, and Terry Jones Jr. in the secondary. They're going to be tasked with stopping a Notre Dame rushing attack that is one of the nation's best. And Notre Dame's rushing offense has not been stopped by anyone this year, but if anyone's equipped to doing it, it is Indiana. Indiana's rushing defense this year is perhaps the nation's best. They're number one in opponent rushing yards per game allowed, only allowing 76.2. Teams don't run in Indiana that much. On average, they only run for 29.1 attempts on Indiana's defense, 5th, because you only average 2.6 yards per carry against Indiana's defense, 2nd, and you only gain about 5.3 rushing first downs per game against that defense too, which is 2nd. Notre Dame in all those categories, by the way, is outside of the top 25. So Indiana's rushing defense is one of the best rushing defenses in the country. It's a better rushing defense than what Notre Dame's rushing offense goes up against in practice, but also they have not played the same rushing offense or anything close to it that Notre Dame has had. Ohio State, when Indiana played them, they were banged up on the O-line, and their offense has been a little bit dysfunctional all season long on the ground. Michigan does not have the rushing offense they did last season or in 2022, although Indiana held them to a season low. And it's the same thing with Michigan State. Not a great rushing offense, but Indiana also held them to a season low. So this is another intriguing matchup. Indiana's rushing defense against Notre Dame rushing offense that has been really an unstoppable force all year. The unstoppable force against the immovable object. That's what makes this game so fascinating. You look at these offenses, and I got to go with Curtis Rourke in Indiana at QB over Riley Leonard. Let's recap with these offenses, shall we? I told you about Notre Dame's offense and Indiana's defense, but let me introduce you to the Indiana offense. That being Elijah Surratt, Miles Cross and Miles Price, Omar Cooper Jr. and Keshawn Williams at wide receiver, Carter Smith, Tyler Steffens, Mike Caddick, Bray Lynch and Trey Wedig on the offensive line, Zach Horton at tight end, Curtis Rourke at quarterback, and Justice Ellison, Tyson Lawton, and Kalen Black at running back. This Indiana offense is very effective at carving you up slowly. They don't get a ton of explosives, but they carve you up, and they do a pretty good job of it too. Very effective on 4th down, very effective on 3rd down. I love Curtis Rourke as a quarterback. The only bad game he had really was against Ohio State and against Michigan in the second half, and I think that was more on his offensive line and the injury on the offensive line that Indiana sadly sustained from Drew Evans, one of their better guards, their best guard of the season, who went down with a season-ending injury. They have more time to respond to that than they did against Michigan, which was pretty quick, and then also Ohio State. But you got to wonder, how can they respond to that? Can they? I like Notre Dame better at running back. I think that's pretty obvious. Indiana's running back room is very good. It's filled with a lot of power backs. Justice Ellison is the one with the most explosivity, but even he is not necessarily a home run hitting back. Notre Dame has power and explosivity, especially in Jeremiah Love, but Jadarian Price is pretty good too. And I like Notre Dame's guards. They're healthier, and also they're better overall than Indiana's. Where I find a push is tight end and center. Mitchell Evans is back, but also Indiana's Zach Horton is pretty good at tight end, and he's been healthier for the year. And Mike Caddick is a dude. He's an absolute unit, an X-factor player for Indiana at center. So is Pat Coogan for Notre Dame, though. So I'm curious to see how these offensive lines do. That's really the position that I'm looking at for both of these teams, because this is going to be one of the better defensive fronts that Indiana has played all year, similar to Ohio State's and Michigan's. I don't think it's as good as those, but Indiana struggled mightily against those defensive fronts, and I imagine that since Notre Dame is a better secondary than Michigan, for example, that they are going to be able to cause some similar havoc. And then for Notre Dame as well, this is probably the best defensive line by a mile that they've played all season long. Best rushing defense. So how do they attack that? How does Mike Denbrock attack this Indiana defensive front is going to be fascinating to me. I don't think either of these teams are just going to be able to punish the other and work the other. Maybe you'll look at the box score after this game and say, maybe Notre Dame really worked Indiana in the trenches, or maybe it's, Indiana working Notre Dame. But I think when watching this game, it's going to be a pretty back and forth affair. On defense, I like Indiana up front over Notre Dame. I do. And I think at DB, it's closer than a lot of people think, because Indiana, they've played Ohio State through the air. And Ohio State through the air is better than anyone that Notre Dame has played all season long. At least they have that. And then Washington is a team that through the air has been good at times throughout the season. Notre Dame, though, on the D line and at linebacker, if you want to make an argument they're better than Indiana, I can't exactly fight against that because both of these teams have played some softer schedules and they've played a lot of different schedules. Notre Dame's played service academies. They've played Georgia Tech. They've played teams that love to run the football, in part because maybe their quarterbacks can't throw or because they're just very good at running the football. It's the same thing with USC. USC is one of the better teams at running the ball. So Notre Dame's played a ton of good rushing offenses, or at least a lot of teams that like running the football and kind of force it down your throat, even if it's not productive to them. Indiana hasn't played that same schedule, but they've also played a schedule that is typically filled with a more consistent, higher caliber of athlete. Like the service academies are limited athletically, limited in the passing attack. Ohio State is not. So there's going to be a learning experience here for both of these teams. I think they'll have to learn and adjust on the fly. For Notre Dame, defensively, R.J. Oben, Howard Cross III, Riley Mills, and Joshua Burnham on the D-line, Jack Kaiser and Drake Boehm and Jalen Sneed at linebacker, and then Christian Gray, Xavier Watts, Adam Schuler, Leonard Moore, and Jordan Clark at the DB position. Those are some players to pay attention to. We already looked over Indiana's defense, talking about Notre Dame's here really quickly. I think Indiana's better up front, D-line and linebacker. DB is a push. If I had to lean one way, it would be toward Notre Dame because they have a future NFL guy in Xavier Watts, who's obviously future NFL, but Notre Dame also suffered an injury there to Benjamin Morrison, which is pretty big. If he was healthy, no question Notre Dame would be better at DB, but he was a pretty big loss, and Indiana has guys like D'Angelo Pons and Sean Asbury who are also great players. Other important things to take note of, I think line of scrimmage is a push. It's a wash. I think we'll discover who is better at the line of scrimmage while watching this game. I think Notre Dame is a better O-line, slightly. Indiana has a better D-line, slightly. Notre Dame's slightly better at tight end, which is often, used in blocking. Notre Dame's deeper everywhere than Indiana is from a talent standpoint. That doesn't mean the roster is better, though. And to circle back to trenches, I think Indiana's D-line has a bigger edge over Notre Dame's D-line than Notre Dame's O-line has over Indiana's O-line. Special teams is also a push. Both of these special teams units have some upside, but are also very questionable. I think both of these rosters are pretty close together. Notre Dame, roster-wise, in terms of depth and also how these teams have played, is probably a little bit better on the interior than Indiana is, but Indiana's better, like way better at wide receiver and better at quarterback. And Indiana has some depth too. I mean, that D-line, you got CJ West, James Carpenter, Tyreek Tucker. You have like 3-4 deep at D tackle for Indiana, one of the most important positions in Big Ten football nationally, especially when it comes to two teams like these, where Notre Dame loves to run the ball. And Indiana does too. They're not as good as Notre Dame is at it, but they love to run the ball, keep opponents honest on defense. I think that you look at what the power ratings say here. Notre Dame's favored by 9.6 points per FPI to win, but they're actually a little bit of the outlier there because S&P Plus thinks that Notre Dame will win but by 5.4 points, and my potential power index is Notre Dame winning by 2.5. And standard home field advantage at minimum is really 3 points, unless you're playing in, like, let's say Duke Stadium or Maryland's. And Notre Dame is a big stadium, good fan base, it's going to be loud. Even factoring that in, Notre Dame's projected to win by about a field goal or maybe a bit less, and that's because my power ratings right now actually has Indiana straight up as a better team on the neutral field than Notre Dame. This is why home field advantage is important, and maybe my power ratings are wrong. I mean, S&P Plus and FPI are high on Notre Dame, higher than I am, especially FPI, who has them as the number 2 team in the country and first in efficiency. Efficiency is just strictly, from my understanding of FPI, efficiency is just what you've done this year, not factoring in anything else. FPI factors in more than just efficiency. It's also priors, it's talent level, and I think that's why Texas is better than Notre Dame in FPIs, because last season especially, and also in terms of recruiting, they're better than Notre Dame. But Notre Dame has looked very impressive this season, and then you add in home field advantage. Home field advantage is so important, especially in college, but in the pros, it's professional as well. It's huge that Notre Dame gets this game at home instead of, let's say, Indiana getting this game at home, because that swing right there, 6 points, maybe you could say 7, that's a lot in a college football game that I think is going to be a close, competitive affair. Indiana has a points per play margin of 0.346, which is insane. That means for every one of their plays compared to every one of their opponent's plays, they score 0.346 more points. Compare that to Notre Dame's, though, 0.422 points per play margin, and you kind of get blown away. Notre Dame's points per play margin is insane. It's number 1 in the nation. It's the only team with a points per play margin above 0.4 this late in the year. It's comparable to Michigan's last year, to Michigan's in 2022, and to Georgia's in 2021. It is this time in the season. And their expected points added margin, 0.229. Indiana's is 0.211. Expected points added measures a lot of field position, like how are you expected to score given where you are on the field. Notre Dame and IU both do a good job of moving the ball well down the field, preventing their opponents from moving the ball well, but also scoring touchdowns. Not just scoring, but scoring touchdowns and preventing their opponents from scoring touchdowns or forcing turnovers or stops on 4th down. Indiana's played the 67th toughest strength of schedule. Notre Dame has played the 59th toughest strength of schedule. So both outside the top 50 there. They're both top 10, though, in game control and efficiency. Indiana's 7th in game control. Notre Dame's 4th. Indiana's also 7th in efficiency. Notre Dame, as I've said multiple times, because it's a highlight statement, but it's true. Indiana is 7th, and Notre Dame is 1st. They're number 1 in efficiency per ESPN. When I look at coaching, which I think is going to be important in a game like this, Marcus Freeman has done a better job this year than last, and a better job last year than his first one. But I cannot get that NIU game out of my head. And there's also the fact that Notre Dame, in terms of recruiting, is more talented than everyone they've played this year, sans Texas A&M. And Texas A&M's recruiting rankings are very overblown because Jimbo Fisher did not develop anyone while he was there. He didn't. Notre Dame's been the most talented team, and it's going to remain the case here. If they beat Indiana, the streak will end when they play Georgia, but they might have the better roster than Georgia. I don't know. Georgia's banged up. People have hated on that statement from me. But Georgia's roster may not be the best roster in the country because they're getting eaten alive by injuries. They are, and you can't next man up yourself over and over and over again. It's impossible. Eventually, those injuries, especially when you don't have aliens at multiple positions, and Georgia doesn't this year, unlike prior years, it's going to catch up to you. Just is. So the Irish have a huge edge. And Indiana has too, because they did well recruiting through the portal. Their roster, I think, is better than the blue chip ratio advertises, for example. But what Indiana has done, coaching circles around basically every staff except for the OSU staff. And I think Indiana's players made a lot of mistakes uncharacteristic to them. And I think that Indiana's going to learn from a game like that. The fact that both of these teams, more importantly, are 11-1 with similar schedules. Notre Dame hasn't played anyone close to OSU all year, and they also lost to NIU. Indiana's played OSU. They lost to them. It was a bad loss, but they've beaten everyone else, even teams with better talent. I do think Cignetti right now is a better head coach than Marcus Freeman. I also think that Indiana has a better defensive staff. They do not have the same talent that Notre Dame does, and yet they're putting out similar results. Notre Dame's better at scoring defense, which is the most important. But you look at the total defense categories, IU rules there. And they're much better at stopping the run, which in a big game like this is very, very important. Where I run into some conflict is strength and conditioning. I think Notre Dame is one of the best strength and conditioning staffs in the country, and the offensive staff. I think that Indiana's offensive staff has been one of the best in the country this year, but Notre Dame is Mike Denbrock. They also have one of the best offensive staffs in the country too. So little areas of conflict. Ultimately, though, I'm going to pick Indiana to upset here. I don't think Notre Dame is the same type of team that OSU is, even with the limitations OSU has. Notre Dame's much better at running the ball than OSU is. Their defense is not the same, though. Their passing offense is not the same. And they're a team that they have some limitations. They're one of the nation's best teams. They're explosive. They'll beat a lot of teams in college football. But what I will tell you is this. Think about Michigan versus TCU in 2022, where the team with a superior roster, an elite rushing offense that no one had stopped all year outside of maybe a half, and a great defense, met up against a team that was well coached, that was senior laden, that was explosive, that had time to prepare, that had a veteran quarterback, and that had players on offense and defense just good enough to make some plays, some impact plays, like a pick six. I'm not saying Indiana's going to do that. In fact, I don't think they will, because I don't think that Riley Leonard is going to be as mistake-prone as J.J. McCarthy was that year. But Indiana's no TCU. They're better analytically than TCU is. Just straight up better analytically. And they've played a tough guy in OSU, and we can still say that. And I think that Notre Dame has limitations. I think that IU is going to slow down that rushing attack just enough to make Notre Dame want to throw it more. And I think that's going to be exposed by an IU defense that is among one of the nation's best. Notre Dame will be able to score on Indiana because I think their rushing offense is that good. Mike Denbrock will have something schemed up. This Notre Dame offense right now is better than OSU's. It is, because the line of scrimmage is that important. But Notre Dame's defense is a fascinating tale. It is, because they're good at stopping the pass, but what great passing offense have they faced all season long? Outside of maybe Louisville, who's, I just say, good, and it's the same thing with USC. They have not played a team like Indiana. I think that IU, with a better coach, will take better advantage of this time off, and I think that IU is more diverse and balanced than Notre Dame is. And in a big game like this with the coaching edge, that matters. My model has Notre Dame winning by 2.5 points. The line is Notre Dame minus 7.5. I'm picking Indiana not just to cover, but I'm picking them to win by a score of 37-31. I think weird things are going to happen in South Bend. Could be lower scoring, probably won't be higher scoring than this, but you never know. It's going to be a weird game, a back and forth game, and I think Indiana comes out on top. All right, next up, talk about Nebraska's staff and also roster changes, and then finally Ohio State, Tennessee, then we'll get on out of here. Nebraska's an interesting case entering 2025, and I'll tell you why here. The Nebraska Cornhuskers finally broke their bolus streak, if that's even a term of usage. They did it. They're going bowling for the first time since the end of the Barack Obama presidency. 2016 was the last time the Cornhuskers went to a bowl game, and they're going to one this year. They're going to be playing Boston College. And while I will be covering that game and Nebraska's season is not over, ultimately bowl season isn't what it used to be. For Nebraska, it's very special. A lot of their players who will be gone after this year are playing in the bowl game. But I want to take a little bit of a look ahead, because their bowl game isn't for several days, if not more than a week away from now. So I want to take a look into 2025 and peer into the future and see what the Cornhuskers might look like next year, and talk about their staff changes, what they need to do in the portal, and all things Cornhuskers, all things go Big Red. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below of Nebraska's roster movement, any concerns you have, any praises you have, what you think of John Butler being named the defensive coordinator and Dana Holgorsen being named the offensive coordinator. Let me know down in the comment section below. We'll kick this off with Nebraska hiring Dana Holgorsen as the offensive coordinator officially. He was the interim offensive coordinator against USC, Wisconsin, and Iowa. A record of 1-2, but he crushed Wisconsin. Nebraska had not beaten Wisconsin in over a decade. Came close to beating Iowa, and I thought did an okay job against USC. And Holgorsen's been a former head coach. He's an offensive mastermind. He has his origins in the Mike Leach offense, and I think that with Dylan Raiola, with the receivers that Nebraska's brought in before and who they're probably going to bring in through the portal, and just how they're constructed, how their offensive line functioned this year, I think this is a good hire. I grade this hire as an A+, because I think that his scheme, which is very adaptive, he can run the ball if need be, create explosivity there, he can pass the ball if need be, and create plays there. I think it'll help Dylan Raiola. Dylan Raiola is a pro-style quarterback. He's not as immobile as, let's say, Cade McNamara or Kyle McCord, but he's not as mobile as let's say, Will Howard or Drew Aller or Aiden Childs or many of these other quarterbacks in the Big Ten, even Iowa's Brennan Sullivan, for example. He's not that mobile. So Raiola is someone who's only going to be making plays really with his arm, maybe occasionally his legs, but that's very occasional. The good news for Raiola is the offensive line this season was much better at pass blocking for much of the year than run blocking. And I also think that Nebraska, you bring back Thomas Fidone, and they have some nice receivers, a young guy in Ja'Cory Barney Jr., for example. And Isaiah Nair and Jamal Banks didn't pan out in the way that Nebraska hoped, but they made a change at wide receivers coach as well, a change that I liked. I'm focusing on the coordinators because the coordinators run the show, but ultimately I do evaluate all these assistants for these Big Ten schools especially, and I will do so. But I mostly care about Dana Holgorsen, and I think that his hiring was the best move possible. You brought him in the regular season. That showed a willingness of Rule to change and adapt that I really liked, and he did well. So, reward him in some capacity. Maybe you could have gotten another offensive coordinator. Maybe there is a better option at offensive coordinator, but Nebraska hired him. He's their guy, and I really like it. And there's not much else that I want to talk about in this regard because I think it's the ideal hire. I think that he's going to do well, and I think Nebraska's offense is going to be the best that it's had since, I don't know, I'd have to go back to a year in Nebraska football that I'm unfamiliar with. It's certainly going to be better than every offense since 2021, and it might even be better than the 2021 offense, I think, based off of the moves I'm anticipating from Nebraska to make in the portal and also who they hired as their offensive coordinator in Dana Holgorsen and the talent they have existing on offense. A hire that I'm not as high on. I'm not calling it an F. I don't think it's this total embarrassment, but I do think it was somewhat weak. I think Nebraska could have done better, was the hiring of John Butler as the defensive coordinator and DB's coach. The DB's coach was the worst unit for Nebraska all season long, which was a bit interesting because it was a unit that was returning a lot of production. Linebacker was hit the hardest by attrition entering 2024, and they did well. And the D-line did well too. It wasn't great, but it was good relative to the expectations. And I think linebacker, in fact, was great relative to expectations. DB was pretty bad. DB was poor relative to what was returning, the expectations. I don't think that they were well coached. And John Butler, here's a little bit of a dirty secret. His only season as a defensive coordinator was at Penn State in 2013, where they did not finish inside the top 50 of scoring defense. Now, again, they were dealing with sanctions then at Penn State. Didn't have all the talent necessary. There was no portal back then. So I could be wrong. Again, I'm not an elite X's and O's guy. I'm not a coach. Never have been. Never will be. And I'm not an insider either. But I can tell you, looking at the analytics, looking at how his room did this year, the fact that, with the Bills in the NFL, he did good, but it's not like his defense was legendary. I have some concerns here. And more importantly than any of this, more than John Butler, I think, is the fact that the defensive scheme for Nebraska is not going to be changed, at least as the base defense. It sounds like they're going to stick with the 3-3-5, which for Baylor in 2019, 2018 was perfect. You're playing Lincoln Riley, you're playing in the Big 12, everything's high-flying, it's an offensive scoring affair, it's an offensive renaissance. We're in a new era of college football, though. 2024 is not like 2019. You have the portal, you have NIL. The game's also shifting to the defenses, in part because there are fewer possessions, because of the running clock rules, and also schemes have caught up to the RPO. They've caught up to the spread. Adaptation has been made possible. You can thank DeAnton Lynn, you can thank Jesse Minter, you can thank Mike McDonald, you can thank Jim Knowles for tweaking his defense. I mean, there's so many defenses that we've seen limit higher scoring, high flying offenses. And as a result, Steve Sarkisian and Lincoln Riley's offenses are not, they're not the best offenses in the country anymore. and they haven't been for 2 years. If not, some would say even longer than that. So I think that to have success in the Big Ten, it's the same thing with Wisconsin, by the way. Wisconsin, I think, wants to get to a point and should get to a point where you can play with 4 down defensive linemen. I just don't think they have the depth for that right now, which is why they're playing that, 3-3-5, 2-4-5. Or maybe they were doing that because that's the defense that Phil Longo preferred. And now that they fired him, maybe they'll move on. But John Butler was an inside promotion, which typically inside promotions, unless it's an assistant coach who's doing phenomenally with his position group, are not a good idea. And even then, some people are meant to be assistant coaches, position coaches, but they're not meant to be coordinators. It's a whole different level of responsibility. And there's no scheme change. The 3-3-5 killed Nebraska in multiple games this year. Against Ohio State, it didn't, but Ohio State was limited on the offensive line. It killed them against USC in stopping the run, killed them against Indiana in stopping the run and getting pressure. It killed them in other games too. And even against UCLA, defense was on the field forever, and it's UCLA. Like, they don't have a lot of talent. They don't have a lot to work with. So I did not like this hire. When I saw it, I just kind of rolled my eyes. It's not the total polar opposite of the Dana Holgorsen hire, but it's close. Holgorsen, in my mind, A+ hire, elite hire. He's a former head coach, offensive mastermind, so he can be the head coach of the offense. Maybe that will help this hire because now maybe Matt Rule will focus more on the defense, but I just kind of shrug my shoulders at this and think Nebraska could have done better. This is not a home run hire, I don't think. And with Tony White going to Florida State and Terrence Knighton, I think that John Butler is a downgrade from Tony White defensively. And sometimes you have to downgrade because there's no option that's better, but I don't think that was the case with Tony White after this past season where the defense was a little bit disappointing for me. So what does Nebraska need to do in the portal? Well, must-haves are running back depth because Gabe Ervin Jr. and Ramir Johnson are gone. Emmett Johnson returned from the portal, which is awesome. It's something to celebrate. I think he's going to be a really good Big Ten running back next year. But maybe getting like a third guy, maybe that would be a good idea. And I think that I do think with how Nebraska, what they want to do on offense, it would be very helpful to have a third guy. I don't know if it's a must-have in hindsight because I have it listed as that. But also, Nebraska did not have a clear RB1. Emmett Johnson emerged as one potentially at the end of the year, but will he be that way next year? Who knows? And I don't think Dante Dowdle's running back number 1. Dante Dowdle is Nebraska's Master Teague. He just has pure downfield vision, doesn't cut very well, doesn't have horizontal ability. He's mainly just a downfield power back. You need someone more than him. So that's another reason why it could be a must-have, is maybe you want someone better than Dante Dowdle to go along with Emmett Johnson. You want to use Dante Dowdle more so situationally, if he would do that. Wide receiver, O-line, D-line, I think are more so must-haves than anything else, though. The trenches have been horrific for Nebraska over the past few years because Scott Frost didn't know how to recruit them. Now, the D-line was great at times this year, but Nash Hutmacher and Ty Robinson are gone. Jamari Butler is gone. Williams Nwaneri, he's transferred in. Williams Nwaneri from Missouri, and that was a good pickup. Former 5-star Nwaneri, and as a true freshman at Missouri, he did see some action. Didn't exactly see a plethora of action here, but he did have a sack, did have a solo tackle. Very talented guy, big, long. I think he'll do well at Nebraska, but they have lost a lot on that defensive line, and also lost Stephon Thompson, depth piece at linebacker, a Bayer at linebacker too. They need players on that defensive front. They need to go in the portal, get several of them, and I think that'll be a good start. And on the offensive line, Nebraska's losing some talent. They have not done the best at developing there. And it's also just a general weakness because of how Scott Frost built his team, and Nebraska was only in year 2 of a rebuild. So I think getting some help on the offensive line would also be pretty wise. And I think finally what would be nice, get some DB help. I think DB has been more of a coaching problem than a developmental problem, given how they got good portal additions, how C.R. Wright did very good this season. It was a very exciting addition for Nebraska, well paid off. Good for him, happy for him. He's a really good player. He's Nebraska's best corner this year, transfer from USC. So it'd be nice, but maybe not a necessity. And then for the quarterback position, I think with Heinrich Harburg moving to tight end, I think that it would be good, and also Daniel Kalin entering the portal, it would be good to get more depth and probably someone with legs, because this team this year was a unit where I thought to myself at times, like, okay, bring in Heinrich Harburg because he has legs and that'll help him negate some of the issues of the offensive line. I think it would be wise for Nebraska to bring in a depth piece at quarterback, a guy with some legs, a guy who you can, they'll probably still use Heinrich Harburg with some wildcat and with some wrinkle position groups or plays next season. But it would be helpful, I think, to add some QB depth, so that would be nice. Overall, I think that the aggression in the portal has been good, but the staff could do better. There could be better staff additions. There could be better coaching. So we'll see if any more moves will be made. I know Nebraska's hired a lot of assistant coaches. I have not pooled over them as much as I have the coordinators, because I think the coordinators are very important, are more important. But I will look at the assistants, and I think after the bowl game, I will go over and grade everything Nebraska's done so far, coaching wise and transfer portal wise in the future. So there will be definitely more done because I expect more moves in the portal in favor of Nebraska. But so far, from what I see, I like the aggression in the portal. Poaching a guy from Missouri who's very highly rated. I expect other highly rated moves, and recruiting's been well, but Coaching's very important. I think coaching can be better for the Huskers. Looking into next year and peering into it with expectations, I think that 7-5 or worse is an absolute failure. 8-4, you're feeling good, you're feeling all right. But at 8-4 with next year's schedule, Nebraska probably doesn't beat anyone of significance. They probably still don't beat a top 25 team next season if they go 8-4. You go 9-3 or better, you probably beat a team who's top 25 at the end of the year, or at least at the time you played them, and you get to 9 wins, which means you probably finish the regular season ranked inside the top 25. I think 9-3 or better is a success. 8-4 is just A-okay, just all right. 7-5 or worse, I would say that is a failure, straight up. So that's my view of the expectations surrounding Nebraska entering 2025. And that is that. Last thing on the agenda. I'm shocked that we have 44 concurrent viewers still. Shocked. Because it's so late. But we only have Ohio State, Tennessee left. Should be 15, 20 minutes. Then I'll get off. And then I'm going to edit all these so I can get these out tomorrow in clips. Some of them even tonight. But probably like just one of them because of the time constraint. The more of your content I see, the more I enjoy the show. Great work, Sam. Thank you very much, Alex Wells. Josh Pate, Joel Klatt, Corn Crazed. They serve as inspirations for the channel. They do. And I want to become at some point in the future. It'll take a while. I mean, it took Josh Pate until his 30s, maybe late 20s, to get to the point where he's at right now. I don't know what his age is, but I'm assuming early 30s. Maybe late 20s. I think early 30s now, but maybe blew up in his late 20s. I know it'll take me some time, but I want to get that big. I want to be up there. And I don't want it to be a competition or anything because you have several big voices in football, but media in college football right now is pretty bad. The ESPN talking heads, the College Football Playoff Committee being a collection of idiots. We need new blood. Like people like Josh Pate who speak their mind even if I don't agree with them on everything. And there are other people like him, trust me. And I want to be one of those other people in college football media. So thank you for the support. I like the fact you enjoy my content, Alex. Colonel Cadmium, thank you very much. Nick P, everyone wants to see Indiana lose because people love to see the same teams win every year. Those times are gone. Anyone can win these days, and I'm so ready for that. Anyone can't win. Not everyone. That's a lie. But there is more opportunity thanks to the portal. And actually, NIL technically gives more opportunity too, because a lot of schools have rich alumni. So that means a lot of schools can technically spend. Like, there is more parity than there ever has been before, and that'll probably remain the case for a while. However, there are still limitations and things that help bigger schools. Like Michigan, for example. Michigan might crowd out some other smaller teams because now that they're getting their alumni base involved, they can outbuy SEC schools. Like, in part, the reason why there is more parity is because the SEC is no longer the best league in everything. They're the deepest league. They're the most talented league. They're still going to produce the more NFL talent in total, but at the top, they're being challenged. The top SEC teams are no longer automatically the best teams in the country. The top Big Ten teams are competing with them. Miami right now, I think, is closer to a lot of the top SEC teams than people want to admit. Miami, Florida. Florida State last year was the same case with a lot of the SEC and Big Ten schools, though I think still a step lower. What I'm trying to say is that at the top, there's more fight, and that results in more blood being spilled, and then the smaller schools at the bottom are like kind of licking up the blood from the floor, and that's helping them a little bit. But I don't think that it's I don't think it's like the NFL, where anyone any year, if they make the right moves, can win it. There is not that level of almost like communist, theoretically, because, not to get like political or anything, but communism doesn't work like a lot of authoritarian systems. But anyway, enough with that. Like, the NFL is very equity based. You all have the same salary cap. The draft is very strict so that no one gets too much talent, for example. Oh, wait, I gotta read this comment. I only subscribe to tell you that you made a huge mistake on that Notre Dame Indiana prediction. You will regret that. Mark my words. I need to be tested for drugs. You know, I've been wrong this year more than last year, but at least I can admit when I'm wrong. I don't pin it on anyone else, and I always make great analysis following the games because I watch the games. If I can't catch the games when they're live, I always make sure to watch, the longer highlight reels. That way I'm not just watching the big plays, but I'm watching some other plays as well. So you'll stay, Walter. I bet you'll stay for the analysis, even if I'm wrong, because it's good over here. But thank you for saying that I need to be tested for drugs. I take that as a compliment. If I'm right, I'm right. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But I do think there will be chaos. I don't see Clemson beating Texas because Dabo Swinney is terrible, and Texas is a huge roster edge. SMU can beat Penn State because James Franklin exists, but that's purely a coaching thing. Like, roster-wise, Penn State should own SMU. And as we've already talked about with Notre Dame and Indiana, roster-wise, those two teams are closer than Penn State and SMU, or Texas and Clemson. And Indiana does have a top 10 head coach in Curt Cignetti. And they've also played someone in Ohio State that Notre Dame hasn't played all season long. So they're more battle-tested when it comes to big teams. I just think there's a pathway for Indiana to win. And if there isn't, then I think that shows more about Notre Dame than Indiana. If Notre Dame blows out IU, and it's not just in the same way that OSU did, Notre Dame might win it all. And that would be very impressive, and something that I honestly wouldn't mind. It'd be kind of cool to see a team that lost to NIU at home win it all. That would be very NCAA 14-esque. We all know of that, like, team that wins it all in that video game but loses in the regular season to someone stupid. It would be straight out of a video game if Notre Dame won it all. And that kind of would be fun, honestly. And Notre Dame fans would deserve that because they've been deprived of success at a high level for very long. Also, wouldn't it be ironic if Notre Dame wins it all 3 years removed from Brian Kelly leaving, and meanwhile Kelly's on the hot seat and fighting for his life at LSU? That makes me smile right there, because like many Notre Dame fans, I do not like Brian Kelly. But let's get on with this, because it's almost midnight and I don't want to go until midnight. Let's talk about Tennessee at Ohio State. The Tennessee Volunteers travel to the Ohio State Buckeyes to play Saturday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And this is Saturday, December 21st. These are two teams that are 10-2. They each have a loss on the road to the top two teams in the country. Tennessee to Georgia, score of 31-17 on the road. No shame in losing in Sanford to the best head coach in college football in Kirby Smart. Ohio State losing 32-31 on the road in Oregon. No shame in losing to a top 5 head coach in Dan Lanning. And 4 time zones away to a team that has the best offense in the country. No shame in that at all, losing in Outson. But then, what really irritates these two fan bases and has irritated me while watching them is Tennessee lost to Arkansas. They lost to 6-6, slimy, grimy, poorly managed Arkansas. Seriously? Score was 19-14. Tennessee couldn't do anything against an Arkansas team that got depanted by LSU, Ole Miss, that lost to 3-9 Oklahoma State. Tennessee couldn't do anything against that team. Very strange, weird, out of the ordinary, just terrible, horrific loss. And for Ohio State, they lost to a 7-5 Michigan team. 13-10. Bad, horrific, confusing loss. The team looked disheveled the entire time, like Tennessee did against Arkansas. These are two teams that at times this year have looked like perhaps the best team in America, or one of. But then other times, it's like, what are you doing? How are you wasting the talent that you have put on your roster, that you have been blessed with? It's mind-boggling. But we're going to talk about these two teams because they're playing in the first round of the playoff, and one of them has to win. One has to win, one has to lose. And that all starts with the matchups here. And the matchup that might determine this game, but also may not. See, this matchup is the most interesting out of all of them. I think that Indiana Notre Dame will be the best matchup, but this is the most fascinating. Like, Indiana Notre Dame, I think, has the potential to be the best in terms of football quality and entertainment. This is the best from the standpoint of intrigue, from the X's and O's, from the coaching, from the response of the fan bases to a win or a loss here. How does Tennessee's rushing defense do against Ohio State's rushing offense? How does that work? Is that even a matchup that matters? Because maybe Ohio State does what many, including myself, think it should do, and they just run an air raid and occasionally mix in the run so that Tennessee doesn't assign 8 people to defend the pass. What happens? Or does Ohio State maybe mix things up on the O-line? They find a formula for success. They try different blocking techniques, and they're able to run the ball here. Or maybe they do those things and Tennessee still kills them on the ground. That's what I'm anxious to see. And this also factors in terms of like pass rush, and can Ohio State block James Pierce Jr., which is something that, I would be very nervous about, to be frank. How does this look? Ohio State's offense at one point was top 5 in points per game. They're down to 35.5, 12th. They're down to 4th in points per play, 0.561. At one point, they were clearly number 1 in the country. They struggle in fourth quarter points per game, in first quarter points per game. They're very good in the bookends of halftime, second quarter and third quarter, but they're outside the top 40 in first quarter points per game and fourth quarter points per game, Ohio State is. And they only, they average 6.7 yards per play, the Buckeyes do, and they're averaging 5 yards per carry, which is 26th and on paper looks good, against Nebraska, against Michigan, and against Oregon and Penn State. If you factor out the bigger runs against Oregon and Penn State, they can't run the football. It's the same thing against Indiana if you factor out Henderson's long run at the end when it was in garbage time. They're averaging 2 to 3 yards per carry. It's even sack adjusted. This rushing offense, ever since Josh Simmons went down, has been bad. And since McLaughlin's went down, it's been an atrocity. And be praying for Simmons, who's declared for the NFL, and also McLaughlin. Run the damn ball, as Seth McLaughlin says on his hat. But this Ohio State rushing game has been bad. Their passing game, on the other hand, they're averaging 8.9 yards per pass attempt, which is 8th. They have a 168 average team pass rating, which is 5th. And they're averaging 12.6 yards per completion. So their passing game is still really good. But they want to run the ball more than passing the football. Like they're averaging 53% run plays, 47% passing plays, and they can't run the football. So that's fascinating for the sole point of, if Ohio State continues with their current identity, that plays right into Tennessee's hands, because Tennessee's not just better at running the football and offense, but when you look at their rushing defense, they're the exact same as OSU. Both of these teams are only allowing 2.9 opponent yards per carry. And Ohio State has the better sack percentage than Tennessee. So actually what that tells you is, when you adjust for sacks, Tennessee is the better rushing defense than OSU does. Tennessee only allows 101.9 yards per game, 6.9 first downs per game. This is a Tennessee defense that is better at stopping the run than the pass. So Ohio State's strategy here should theoretically be pass the football a lot and run to keep them honest, but rely on your defense and Jeremiah Smith to get to them. But they have not been willing to do that. Against Penn State, against Oregon early, though against Oregon early before Simmons went down, the running game did have some success. Against Michigan for the entire game, against Indiana for much of the game, they refused to go to a pass-heavy set, a formation, a play style, even though it's been working and everyone who watches the TV sees that it works. And they just... Ohio State's offensive staff this year, and we'll talk about this as the show goes on, has been one of the best in America at shooting themselves in the foot. It's unbelievable. So this is an intriguing matchup, not just in that context, but in general too, because let's say Ohio State does go pass heavy, but they run the ball to keep Tennessee honest or to maybe catch them by surprise. That's still important. If Ohio State succeeds at running the ball by reducing the carries, and you have addition by subtraction, and they succeed on Tennessee, well, Tennessee's defense is going to have a hard time defending against that, and also the pass attack of OSU. But if they succeed, regardless of OSU's game plan, that's going to make it a lot easier for a shaky Tennessee secondary to defend elite athletes that Ohio State has in Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, and also OSU's running backs out of the backfield, and Will Howard, who's been a pretty good quarterback. Next up for another matchup is Tennessee's pass rush, their passing defense, against Ohio State's passing offense. I think that Tennessee, if they're going to win this game, is going to have to make this slow. They're going to have to make it low scoring. They're going to have to bog OSU down. If this becomes a shootout, unless Nico Imaliava plays a game that I have not seen him play all season long, Tennessee will not win. And you never want to count on one of your players playing a game that he has not played all season. And if Tennessee does play that game, let's say they win in a shootout, well, they're not going to have that performance again, likely, and therefore they'll have to play a different game. They'll have to force their opponents to play uglier games in the future if they want to win in the playoff. Their defense it's really good, Tennessee's is. So that's also why I'm taking this angle, is because they can bog OSU down. I don't expect Ohio State to score in the 40s here, regardless of what happens. And I would say high 30s is probably the peak. 20s, lower 30s is probably what you should expect from OSU in this game. For Tennessee, you probably expect, low mid 20s here. Power ratings say OSU should win, not by that much. We'll get to that in a bit. But that's kind of the angle I'm taking here. Both of these teams can hold each other to the teens. There's even a world, I think, where these teams can hold each other to single digits. Ask me why. Michigan held OSU to 10 points for a whole game, and Tennessee was held to 0 points in the first half against Alabama. They also held Alabama to 7 points in the first half. So those are some things to consider. You look at Tennessee's defense here. You got the legendary James Pierce Jr., Bryson Eason, Omar Norman Lott, Amari Thomas, and Dominic Bailey on the D-line. You have Jeremiah Tillander, Arian Carter at linebacker, and at secondary, Jermon McCoy, Andre Turrentine, Will Brooks, Ricky Gibson III, and Christian Harrison. For Ohio State's offense, you have wide receiver Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, Emeka Egbuka, and Brandon Innes as your main guys. On the O-line, Donovan Jackson, Carson Hinsman, Austin Siereveld, Tegra Shabola, and Josh Fryer. And they may try to mix in Luke Montgomery or Josh Padilla, George Fitzpatrick, anyone they can. It sounds like from what Day has said, they do want to mix up on the offensive line. That's because this right now is one of the worst, if not perhaps the worst offensive line in the 12-team college football playoff. Based off of what I saw against Indiana, what I saw against Michigan, what I've seen against Nebraska, for example. And Tennessee's D-line is mean. It's one of the better D-lines in all of football, one of the better D-lines in the playoffs. Is the best? I don't know. I would straight up venture to say maybe not, but it's close. It can contend for being the best. And James Pierce Jr. no doubt is one of the better players on defense in the college football playoff. You look at Tennessee's pass rush, and while their sack percentage is not number one, it's still top 30. It's 7.91 sack percentage, and they average 2.5 sacks per game. Very impressive numbers right there. They only allow 6.1 yards per pass attempt, which is 15th, and 10.7 yards per completion, which is 24th. It's not quite the same as OSU's. OSU is a 10.51 sack percentage. Ohio State only allows 5.8 yards per pass attempt and 9.7 yards per completion. And something that's fascinating is when you look at the pass rush on the other side, OSU only allows a 3.37 quarterback sack percentage, which is 18th. Now, it's obviously worse than that because of the injuries, and it's being propped up by stats in the prior year. Tennessee has a quarterback sack percentage allowed of a 7.45, which is 91st, and OSU is second in sack percentage from their defense. That's a massive mismatch in favor of OSU. OSU's pass rush, their blitzes versus Tennessee's offensive line and protecting Nico. But it can be the same thing in favor of Tennessee. And Tennessee can get pressure with 4 because they have James Pierce Jr. Ohio State has struggled all season long to get pressure with 4. Before the Indiana game, and I imagine it's the same now because they didn't get any sacks on Michigan, Ohio State has struggled to get pressure with 4. In fact, only about 50% of their sacks on the season came from the defensive line, if not less. That's an atrocious ratio. They need their linebackers and safeties to get pressure, and that's a liability against better teams. It just is. That's how it works, because that means there's less guys in coverage, more opportunities for opponents' receivers to make plays if they are schemed properly. Ohio State's passing offense, speaking of scheme, when Chip Kelly calls passing plays, when they scheme properly, when they use their talent, it's very effective. They are 4th in completion percentage, averaging a 70.35% completion percentage. They average 8.9 yards per pass attempt. They average a 168 passer rating. Again, they average through the air, or just overall, 6.7 yards per play, 423.6 yards per game. Part of the reason Ohio State is so successful, though, at throwing is they only average 28.7 pass attempts per game, which is 87th. Tennessee, though, averages 27.1, even fewer attempts per game, and they only complete 63% of their throws. I mean, QB play for Tennessee has been quite the struggle this season. OSU, what you want is you want the secondary matchup to be the critical matchup, and you want to pass heavy, mix in the run to stay honest, and have your defense play at the level it has all season long. If you're Tennessee, you want the matchup to be the former, but maybe it won't. If it is, you'll probably have automatic success because Ohio State's offensive line is bad, straight up bad. Some people have talked about, like, if they change the technique or if they mix it up, it'll be so much better and we'll be able to run the ball successfully again. You might be better, but this team for the rest of the year, I will tell you right now, probably will not have success running the ball as their main course of action. You'll want to pass to open up the run if you're OSU, not the other way around. But if you're Tennessee and you get stuck with this matchup, a matchup that might be more likely, but maybe it won't, what you want to do is get pressure on Will Howard. You want to give Chip Kelly a numbers advantage in the box so that he tries to run the ball, because Chip Kelly's offense, a lot of it's about numbers edge. So if you can stop the run with 4, only send 4. Dare Ohio State to run and make it easier on your DBs and linebackers to defend the pass. When I look at these offenses, I like Tennessee at tight end, center, and guard more than OSU. And Ohio State's center and guard play has been pretty mediocre, if not bad, right now. Tight end play is pretty similar. But I like Ohio State a lot more at quarterback, wide receiver, and while I think Ohio State at tackle is a bit suspect, I think Tennessee's pretty bad at tackle. So I actually give Ohio State something on the offensive line over Tennessee, the tackle position. Quarterback, Will Howard's been much better than Nico this year. And Ohio State's wide receivers have been elite. Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, Brandon Inniss, Carnell Tate. Tennessee, they got Brew McCoy, Chris Brazzell II, Squirrel White, and Dante Thornton at wide receiver. Not the same caliber. Other offensive players are Lance Hurd, Andrej Karic, Cooper Mays, Javonte Spraggins, John Campbell Jr. at O-line, Miles Kitzelman, Holden Stays at tight end, Nico Imaliava at QB, Cole Harrison at fullback, and Dylan Sampson at running back. Sampson is ridiculously good. The only reason I make it a push at running back is I think OSU's way deeper. Judkins and Henderson are... I'm not going to call them elite running backs anymore, because I think elite running backs, like let's say a Caleb Johnson, would do more with this offensive line and with these weapons than they have. But they're great near elite running backs, and having 2 of them in the same room, that is huge. Tennessee has 1 running back who I think is better than both of these right now, at least in terms of explosivity, but Dylan Sampson does have a fumble problem. Dylan Sampson has over 20 rushing touchdowns. A large part of the secret to Tennessee's success is not their yards per carry, where they only average 5, which is 29th. It's rather the fact they run for some of the most out of all teams in the nation. 60% of their plays, 60.78% to be specific, are rushing plays. And they run the ball for about 45.4 attempts per game, which is 5th. They punish you. They wear you down. And Dylan Sampson does not get tired. And their defense makes it so that they can lean on the ground, and they have enough talent on the perimeter to make you pay if you were too aggressive in stopping the run. So both of these offenses have a bit of dysfunction. They also have a lot of talent. I like Tennessee more on the O-line, tight end. Running back's a push, but if I had to lean one way right now, it honestly would probably be Tennessee. But maybe it's OSU. I prefer OSU's depth, honestly. In fact, yeah, I'd lean OSU at running back if I had to right now. I prefer their depth. I just think that their O-line really holds them back. A quarterback, wide receiver, and offensive tackle, I'd go to OSU. I think that defensively, Tennessee's better at corner. Ohio State's corners this year have been carried, I think, in large part by every other position group. Scheme, the best safety room in the country that resides at Ohio State, a linebacker room that's top 10, if not top 5, could be the best in the nation, and a D tackle room that I think is pretty good. D end is a push. I prefer OSU's depth, but James Pierce Jr. is a much better defensive end than JT Tuimoloau or Jack Sawyer. I would take the X Factor player there. So I'd personally prefer Tennessee's defensive end room compared to Ohio State's right now. Corner, I don't think it's much of a question. Safety is also not much of a question. Safety is probably the greatest disparity here on this list. Ohio State has Lathan Ransom, Caleb Downs, Jordan Hancock. Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs are the best safety duo in the country. Add in Jordan Hancock, who's a nickelback, which is typically kind of referred to as a safety position. That's the 3 best starting safeties in any 4-2-5 defense in college football right now. And I like D tackle for OSU. Linebacker, I love Cody Simon's been an awesome player this year. But Tennessee, I think Omar Norman Lott up front is really, really good. I think that Bryson Eason, Omari Thomas, they have a good D tackle room. Might be deeper than OSU's. Might. There's debate there. And James Pierce Jr. has been a weapon up front. Huge mismatch. That's something Ohio State's going to have to pay attention to. Abdul Carter, it took him a quarter or two to figure out OSU's defense, but eventually he began working Donovan Jackson. Will that happen with James Pierce Jr. and if he's matched up with Donovan Jackson or Josh Fryer? We'll have to see. I think that let's look at Ohio State's defense because I didn't mention them, and then we'll get to the other things. You have Jack Sawyer, Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams, GT Tuimoloau on D-line, Cody Simon, Sonny Styles at linebacker, and Denzel Burke, Lathan Ransom, Caleb Downs, Davison Igbinosun, and Jordan Hancock in the secondary. By the way, if you look at Ohio State's corner room, and again, I'm not a coach, so I don't want to be too critical here. Look at Jermaine Matthews Jr. Look at him to replace Davison Igbinosun or Denzel Burke. I doubt it happens, but I think maybe it should happen because Jermaine Matthews Jr., I think, is a potential future All-American. Burke has struggled this year, and Igbinosun just can't help himself but commit PI. He can't. And I don't know if that's a coaching thing or if that's just who he is, but it's kind of sad, honestly. Other important things to pay attention to, I think Tennessee is better on the lines of scrimmage if I had to choose a side, but I'm leaving it as a push because there is a chance that OSU is better. I think OSU's played the tougher strength of schedule. Tennessee per metrics has, but I think that Oregon and Penn State and Indiana is a better high-level group of teams to play than Alabama and Georgia. That's just my thought process right there. Like the best teams on your strength of schedule matter exponentially more than the smaller teams do. They should not be counted equally in strength of schedule. And I think, I don't know if this is exactly what College Football Nerds said, but they use that as part of the logic behind why Georgia lost some games this year that were uncharacteristic, and I don't disagree with that at all. Like, if they have a really tough schedule, or that's not the logic. If they have a really easy schedule and their only tough game is at Ole Miss, they might beat Ole Miss on the road or at least play them closer because they're more rested, they're not as battered, not so many opponents to focus on, for example. I think that special teams goes Tennessee's way. Ohio State's special teams unit outside of Caleb Downs when he returns punts has been pretty bad. Ohio State's better in terms of the blue chip ratio. They're the more talented roster in terms of recruiting. And I think their roster in terms of what I've watched this year is better. They are more functional overall on defense and passing offense. Tennessee is better at running the football. And a huge part of the third reason is because Ohio State's banged up, which is not a total excuse. They've poorly developed on the O-line. I don't think it's a coincidence that Simmons and Seth McLaughlin were both incoming transfers. I don't think that's much of a coincidence. They haven't developed, let me rephrase it. They haven't developed horribly, but their development's been very hit and miss, and they haven't recruited well. And outside of the two incoming transfers, it feels like they've developed pretty terribly. So make from that what you will, but at every other position, they've developed either above average or average to elite. So I like Ohio State's roster. I mean, I still think it's loaded. It's one of the better rosters in the country. They just have some critical weaknesses. They're mortal. You look at what the power ratings say and who they favor. Per FPI, Ohio State's favored by 7. Per S&P Plus, they're favored by 6.1. Per My Potential Power Index, Ohio State's favored to win this game by 15. And I think this kind of pans out here. I mean, Tennessee is not as good analytically. The power ratings will tell you that. You look at points per play margin, for example. Tennessee is 0.239 points per play margin, a 0.21 expected points added margin. Ohio State, meanwhile, is a 0.383 points per play margin, which means for every one of their plays compared to every one of their opponent's plays on an average basis, they score 0.383 more points, which is second. And they have an expected points added margin of 0.281. Tennessee got dominated by Georgia at the end of the day. Ohio State only lost to Oregon by a point. Michigan is a better team than Arkansas in terms of talent, in terms of power ratings. And there's also the fact that Tennessee has struggled in a variety of other games, almost losing to Florida. Yikes. Vanderbilt got on them early. Now, Tennessee, to their credit, won that game. I don't really hold that against them. But there's also the fact that the majority of their dominant performances came against Chattanooga, they came against Kent State, and they came against NC State. All pretty bad teams. Ohio State has, dominated Indiana. They dominated bad teams like Northwestern, Purdue, dominated a good team in Iowa, for example. They survived Nebraska. They controlled Penn State for much of that game in the same way that Oregon controlled Penn State for much of that game, where Penn State could have won. It wasn't a blowout. It wasn't never in doubt, but Ohio State was just one step ahead, seemingly all the time. I think Ohio State's been the more impressive team. They've done a better job of scoring and preventing their opponents from scoring. You look at the strength of schedules per ESPN, they're pretty equal. Tennessee 28, Ohio State 29. Tennessee is 9th in game control, 8th in efficiency, and the Buckeyes are 5th in game control, 3rd in efficiency. You see some of that up and downness in that game control where these teams have had a lot of dominant performances, but they have had some performances that just make you have an eyesore, that give you a black eye, like the Arkansas and Michigan games for the Volunteers and Buckeyes respectively. And then they had some of their vulnerabilities exploited in the Georgia game for Tennessee and the Oregon game for Ohio State. I think that Tennessee's better at strength and conditioning right now. I've been very critical of Ohio State's strength and conditioning program for years. I think going back to 2022, definitely last year, large part of this year, it's been very evident they do not know how to develop, especially along the lines of scrimmage. Got it at wide receiver, got it at quarterback. I think Will Howard's progression from Kansas State to Ohio State's been very clear that he's developed into a better QB. He's just not elite, which you're not going to get an elite quarterback every year. Like Nick Saban didn't. Kirby Smart hasn't. Even Lincoln Riley hasn't. So they do a good job at developing at all things except for the lines of scrimmage. And I think Tennessee has done a better job there and a better job overall given their talent. I think they're better conditioned and more physical. I do think Ohio State, though, is the better head coach. I think Day is better than Heupel. I think that Jim Knowles is better than Tim Banks, same with his assistants. An area that's a push for me, is the offensive staff. I question which offensive staff is better. On one hand, analytics say OSU's offense is clearly better, but I also know that Ohio State's a lot more talented and balanced on offense than Tennessee is. And Chip Kelly's called some pretty atrocious games this year. Granted, so has Tennessee, but that's an area where I wonder if this game maybe tells us who has the better offensive staff, in the sense that maybe the school with the better offensive staff is the one that wins this game. Regardless of all of that, factoring all of that in, I'm picking Ohio State to win, and I'm picking them to cover. I think that Ohio State right now is just as good as Georgia is right now. There is a coaching difference. I think Georgia is better coaching-wise, but I think that with it being in the shoe, and with Ohio State having better talent at DB everywhere across the board, wide receiver across the board, having the better QB, having the better linebackers, a D-line that, while I would lean Tennessee if I had to, I think it's pretty close. And that with the home field advantage. It could also be a home field disadvantage for Ohio State. People have talked about that, and I don't think it's overstated. The crowd could work against OSU, but ultimately it's still going to work against Tennessee, because when Ohio State's defense is on the field, that place is going to get loud, and the fans are going to get restless. And the defense does its job. There's not much to boo about in regards to the defense. So I do think Ohio State covers here, and I think they win 31-17. I could be wrong. This game's much harder to read than Penn State SMU or Texas versus Clemson. And it might be harder to read than Indiana versus Notre Dame as well, because there isn't a lot to cross-reference here between the teams that Ohio State has played and the teams that Tennessee has played. I'm picking Ohio State to win, picking them to win by double digits, 31-17. Wouldn't be shocked if Tennessee maybe wins in like a 20-13 game. Actually, I wouldn't be shell-shocked, but I'd be a little bit surprised if Tennessee won in that style of game. And it would be a huge negative for not just the Big Ten, but also for Ryan Day. That would be quite the gut punch to end the season. All right, man, we're done. It's 11:36, and this show has been nearly going on for 3 hours. Sorry that I took up all this time for you guys. But we have 40 likes, 42 concurrent viewers, which we've held for most of the live stream. Thank you guys so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Like, honestly. This is probably the longest show we're going to do ever, like, live, because I don't want to go for 3 hours live for most days. Yeah, we'll be live briefly tomorrow, by the way, for like an hour, but it won't be more than an hour because we'll just be talking about like 6 things that aren't game previews that don't have like 11 slides or 12 slides or a bunch of analytics to go over. It'll just be a lot of brief, 8 to 15 minute stuff. It'll be fun. So hit the notification bell, subscribe, like. I'll see you guys very soon. In fact, tomorrow, sometime between 11 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Bye-bye.